They left her to die in the blizzard. They laughed when she begged. They told her she was worthless, that an Omega like her had no place among the pack, no right to their fire, no claim to their mercy. And on that night, the night the entire kingdom thought would bury her beneath the snow forever, fate came knocking at the rotting door of Mara Vance's broken-down cabin. Not once, not twice, 15 times, and every single knock was a life hanging by a thread, a heartbeat away from being lost to the cold forever. The question is, could one Omega that nobody remembered, an Omega that everyone had thrown away, save an entire dynasty? Stay until the very end to find out exactly how she did it. Hit like if you're rooting for Mara, and drop your city in the comments so we know where you're watching from. The Wolves of Ironwood territory had a saying, passed down from alpha to alpha, like a sacred law carved into stone. The weak are winter's gift to the earth. Mara Vance had heard it her entire life. She heard it the first time she failed to bring down a deer at age 12, her small frame trembling under the weight of a bow, 3 sizes too large for her shoulders. She heard it whispered behind her back at pack meals, when the elders served her last, and the children laughed openly at the way her hands shook from cold. She heard it most clearly on the night Alpha Roderick Hale stood before the entire pack, 63 wolves gathered in the firelit great hall of the Ironwood Lodge, and pointed at her like she was a stain on the floor. Mara Vance is an Omega, he had said, and Omegas who cannot pull their weight have no place warming their backs at our fire. She was 17 years old. Now, at 22, she lived in a cabin so far from the Ironwood Lodge that on clear nights she could barely see the orange glow of their hearths through the tree line. The cabin had belonged to her grandmother, a healer who had died the previous spring. The roof leaked in 4 places. The south wall had a crack running from floor to ceiling that let in fingers of frozen air every time the wind turned. The front door didn't close flush anymore. She had stuffed the gap with a strip of rabbit fur and a folded piece of oilskin, and it held mostly unless the gusts came from the northwest. Tonight, the gusts were coming from the northwest. Mara sat cross-legged on her sleeping mat, stitching a torn section of her only heavy coat by the light of a tallow candle. Outside, the wind had been building since midday, a low, constant moan that had risen by evening into something that made the cabin walls shudder and creak like a living thing in pain. She had checked her firewood 3 times already. Stacked against the eastern wall, 47 pieces of split birch, 2 bundles of pine kindling, and 6 compressed blocks of peat she had traded 2 rabbit pelts for back in autumn. It was enough. Probably enough. If she was careful, if the storm passed by morning the way the old ache in her left knee suggested it would. The candle flame bent sideways. A draft, sharp and sudden, came through the rabbit fur seal on the door. Mara pressed her fingers against it, feeling the cold bite at her skin, and looked at the window. The glass, barely half an inch thick, had begun to frost at the corners, crystalline blooms spreading inward from the edges like white flowers opening in fast motion. Through the center, where the frost hadn't yet claimed it, she could see nothing. Only white. Not the white of moonlight on snow. The solid, suffocating white of a whiteout. "There it is," she said quietly. She had known it was coming. 2 days ago, she'd climbed the ridge east of her cabin and watched the sky over the northern mountains. Watched the color of it. The particular shade of iron gray that her grandmother had called the iron ceiling. The kind of sky that meant the storm wasn't just big, but hungry. The kind of sky that meant the territory was about to be buried. She had gone to the Ironwood Lodge that same afternoon. She had not wanted to go. Every step toward that place cost her something, a piece of her that she had spent years quietly rebuilding. But she had gone, because the storm was bigger than her pride, and because there were things she needed. More firewood, salt, perhaps a share of the preserved meat the pack kept in the underground cold cellar. She hadn't asked for much. She never asked for much. Alpha Roderick had been standing on the lodge porch when she arrived. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw like the edge of a cliff and eyes the color of dirty ice. He had looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that flat, barely concealed contempt that had no particular heat in it because contempt implies you consider the other person worth the effort of emotion. What Roderick had for Mara wasn't contempt. It was simpler than that. It was nothing. "Storm's coming," she had said. "I need to replenish before it hits." Pack stores are for pack members, he'd replied, not even turning fully to face her. You live on the edge of the territory. You maintain your own supplies. I helped the fall harvest. I gave 3 weeks of... You picked berries. His voice hadn't risen. It never did. Children pick berries, Mara. That doesn't earn you a place at the winter table. There had been 2 other pack members on the porch. Denny Wolf, a young enforcer with a wide, stupid face and an eager need to please whoever held power near him, and Senna Cole, a mid-ranked female who had once, years ago, been the closest thing Mara had to a friend, before rank and pack politics had made friendship with an Omega more trouble than it was worth. Denny had laughed, a short bark of sound. Senna had looked away. I'll be fine, Mara had said, because there was nothing else to say. She had walked back to her cabin. She had counted her firewood 4 times on the way home. Now the storm had arrived, and the Ironwood Lodge was almost certainly packed with warm, fed wolves who had forgotten she existed. The great hearth would be blazing. There would be food, stewed meat probably, with root vegetables and dried herbs, and there would be bodies pressed close together along the benches, sharing heat the way wolves did, instinctively, without thinking about it. That was the nature of a pack. Warmth was communal. Safety was communal. Even for wolves who didn't particularly like each other, the cold was an enemy they faced together. Unless you weren't really part of the pack. Unless you were just a leftover, a loose thread, a technical member by blood and territory, but nothing else. Mara added a piece of birch to the fire and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She was fine. She was going to be fine. She had survived 5 winters in this cabin, and she would survive this one. She was small, yes, smaller than any wolf her age should be, her Omega status marking itself in her frame and the subtle difference in her scent. That soft, non-threatening quality that higher-ranking wolves either ignored or used as a signal to push. But she was not fragile. She had learned, through years of necessity, exactly how fragile she was not. She was good at stretching resources, good at silence and patience, good at the quiet survival work that nobody celebrated but everybody needed, setting snares, preserving meat, identifying the plants that stayed edible under snow, knowing which injuries could be treated with what was already growing at the forest's edge. Her grandmother had taught her all of it, not as gifts, but as survival tools, the things a woman alone in the world needed to know. Being small doesn't mean being weak, her grandmother had told her once. It means learning to do more with less, which, in the end, makes you stronger than most. Mara had not entirely believed that when she was a child. She was beginning to believe it now. The storm hit full force just after midnight. The sound of it was extraordinary. Not the howling she'd expected, but something deeper, a sustained roar that came from all directions at once, as though the entire sky had dropped to ground level and was pressing down on the territory with both hands. The cabin shook. Twice. The fire guttered in the hearth, and she had to cup her hands around it and breathe carefully until it caught again. She moved her sleeping mat closer to the hearth, wrapped herself in both of her blankets, one wool, one a patchwork of rabbit skins she'd sewn together over 3 winters, and lay still, listening. She was almost asleep when she heard the first sound, a scratch, faint, nearly swallowed by the roar of the storm, but distinct. Mara's eyes opened. She lay still for a moment, listening. The scratch came again, low, barely above the floor level of the door, the kind of sound made by something that didn't have the strength to lift its limb high enough to knock properly. Not a branch, not the wind finding a new gap in the cabin wall. Something alive. She was on her feet before she consciously decided to move. At the door, she pressed her palm flat against the wood. Cold had soaked through it until the planks were almost as frigid as the air outside. She could feel something on the other side, not hear it, feel it, a vibration too faint and too intermittent to be the storm, a labored, desperate scraping. She put her ear against the wood. A sound reached her, low, exhausted, the kind of sound a wolf makes when it has been running for hours, and the cold has gotten into its lungs, and every breath is a small act of will. A whimper. "Hold on," she said, and her own voice surprised her, steady, calm, already in the mode her grandmother had called work voice, the tone that meant there was no time for feeling yet. She grabbed the iron bar that she kept across the door at night, lifted it, and braced herself. The door blew inward. The cold hit her like a physical force, a wall of air so dense with ice crystals that for a moment she couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe, could only stand with her arms up and her eyes squinted against the assault of it. She grabbed the doorframe with both hands to keep from being pushed back. At her feet, barely across the threshold, was a wolf. Large, male, she thought, though the ice coating its fur made it hard to be certain, with dark gray fur matted and rigid with frozen moisture. It had collapsed the moment the door opened, as though it had been holding itself up by will alone, and the release of even that tiny barrier had undone it completely. Its legs were folded wrong, shaking in slow, violent spasms. Its eyes were open but unfocused, the pale gold of them glassy and distant, the look of a creature that was still technically conscious but had already begun the long internal retreat that came before death. "Inside," Mara said. "Come on. Inside." She grabbed the wolf's forelegs and pulled. It didn't resist, didn't have the strength to, and she dragged it across the threshold with both hands, her back screaming with the effort. The wolf was enormous. Even half frozen and collapsed, it weighed more than twice what she did. She got it fully inside, then turned and fought the door closed against the wind, dropping the bar back into place with shaking hands. She turned back to the wolf, knelt, pressed her fingers against the side of its neck. Pulse. Faint. Wrong rhythm. Too slow, stuttering, the body's heat conservation mode already stealing resources from the heart to protect the core. Hypothermia. Severe. She had maybe an hour, possibly less, before... Another scratch at the door. Mara went still. Then she was moving again, lifting the bar, bracing against the wind, pulling a second wolf inside. This one was smaller, female, she thought, with pale silver fur so caked with ice that she looked more like a statue than an animal. Same glazed eyes, same failing pulse. Third knock. Fourth. By the time she had the fifth wolf dragged inside, her cabin looked like something from a fever dream. Enormous gray and dark shapes laid out across every available floor space. Her furniture pushed to the walls, ice melting into spreading puddles across the floorboards. The fire was working hard, but the temperature in the cabin was dropping, too many cold bodies drawing the warmth out of the air. She didn't stop to count. She didn't stop to wonder where they had come from or why there were so many. She just kept opening the door. 8 wolves, 10, 12. On the 13th trip, she found 2 wolves tangled together on the step, one larger animal that had apparently been trying to shelter the smaller one with its own body. She dragged them both in, one at a time, the larger one fighting her with the last ghost of instinct, a low warning sound from deep in its chest, before its eyes lost focus again, and it stopped fighting. "You're safe," she told it, though she wasn't sure it could hear her. "You're inside. I've got you." 14, 15. When she closed the door for the last time, she stood against it for a moment with her eyes shut, her lungs burning, her hands so cold they had gone past pain into a strange, buzzing numbness. Then she opened her eyes and looked at her cabin. 15 wolves. Laid out across every foot of floor space, some overlapping, steam beginning to rise off their coats as the room's warmth, what was left of it, began to touch their outer layers. The fire was still burning, but she could see from here that it was working against the odds, that the temperature balance was precarious, that if she didn't make decisions fast, she made decisions fast. Every piece of furniture that could burn and wasn't essential. The second chair, the decorative shelf her grandmother had built, 2 wooden crates she'd been using for storage. She broke them apart with the hand hatchet she kept by the hearth and fed them into the fire in pieces, building the blaze until it was as large as the hearth could safely hold. Larger, probably. The cabin filled with light and heat. She didn't care if it was safe. Safe was a calculation for situations where the stakes were lower. Blankets. She had 2, plus the spare lengths of wool her grandmother had kept folded in the cedar chest. She hadn't touched those in a year, hadn't wanted to, but she pulled them out now without hesitation and spread them over the wolves closest to the walls, where the cold from outside was strongest. The 2 largest ones, in the center, generated enough body heat that she left them. The small, silver-furred female she had found second, she had barely a whisper of a pulse now, her body so cold that even the heat of the fire hadn't reached her yet. Mara pulled her to the edge of the hearth and covered her completely. then pressed her own hands against the wolf's rib cage and held them there, willing warmth through. "Come on," she said quietly. "Come on, stay with me." She worked through the rest of the night. She moved from wolf to wolf with the systematic focus her grandmother had drilled into her, checking pulses, clearing airways, rubbing limbs where the circulation had slowed to dangerous levels, adjusting positions so that the animals' bodies could draw warmth from each other as well as from the fire. She rationed her firewood with brutal precision, feeding the fire in calculated doses, never letting it drop below the threshold she'd determined in her head, but never letting it waste either. The food was harder. She had a pot of rendered fat, half a smoked haunch of venison that was supposed to last her another week, a string of dried fish, 2 jars of preserved berries, and a sack of cornmeal. For herself, in a normal week, it was adequate. For 15 hypothermic wolves who would, if they survived, wake up starving. She made the venison into broth, every scrap of it, cut the smoked meat off the bone, broke the bone itself and simmered it, added the dried fish and most of the fat. The smell of it filled the cabin, rich and animal thick, and she watched the nostrils of the wolves nearest the fire twitch and flicker as the scent reached them through their stupor. "That's it," she said. "That's right. Come back." Around 3 in the morning, the large male, the one who had tried to warn her off with that ghost of a growl, shifted. Not a conscious shift, she thought, but the involuntary kind that sometimes happened when a wolf's system was under extreme stress, the body reaching for whatever form offered the best chance of survival. One moment there was a gray wolf on her floor. The next, there was a man. He was large, larger than she'd realized from the wolf form, well over 6 feet, built through the shoulders and chest with the dense, layered muscle of a wolf, who spent his life in demanding physical conditions. His hair was dark, nearly black, matted with the ice that hadn't finished melting. His face was striking in a way that had nothing soft in it. A strong jaw, a straight nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, and even in unconsciousness a quality of authority so ingrained it showed up in the set of his jaw and the angle of his chin. He had 2 parallel claw marks running from his left shoulder down across his ribs, deep, not fresh, the kind of scarring that spoke of old battles. And across his left forearm, partially obscured by ice crystals and the smear of old blood, was a mark she recognized even through the distortion, a crown within a circle of thorns. She had seen that mark exactly once before, on a courier who had passed through Ironwood territory 2 years ago, carrying a message from the northern capital, a royal seal, the mark of the House of Nightfall, the ruling house of the northern kingdoms, the oldest and most powerful pack dynasty in living memory. Mara sat back on her heels and looked at the unconscious man on her floor. Then she looked at the 14 other wolves, now all stirring, slowly, with the reluctant, disoriented movement of creatures coming back from very far away, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, Of course this is how tonight was going to go. She pressed the back of her hand against his forehead, still dangerously cold but no longer the stone-deep chill of severe hypothermia. His pulse, when she found it at the side of his neck, was stronger. Unsteady, but stronger. His breathing had evened out into something that was almost sleep rather than the shallow, failing rhythm she'd heard when she first dragged him in. He was going to live. They were all going to live. She sat on the floor among 15 wolves, 14 still in their shifted forms, 1 unconscious man with a royal mark on his arm, and felt something move through her chest that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride. Pride had a kind of heat to it, a brightness. This was quieter than that. This was the particular satisfaction of a person who has been told their whole life that they are not enough, encountering a problem that required everything they had, and discovering that everything they had was exactly sufficient. Sufficient. Not barely. Not just. Exactly. She stayed awake through what was left of the night, tending the fire, checking pulses, adjusting blankets, keeping watch. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world, throwing itself against her walls with a fury that seemed personal. Inside, 15 lives breathed steadily in the orange light of a fire she had built and maintained and refused to let die. The candle she'd been stitching by when the night began had long since guttered out. She didn't need it anymore. The fire was enough. The first light of dawn came gray and muted through the frosted window, The storm still howling, but the absolute darkness of the deepest hours beginning, at last, to ease. Mara was sitting against the wall beside the hearth, her knees drawn up, her eyes open but heavy with exhaustion, when she heard movement across the room. The large male. The man with the royal mark. He was awake. He hadn't moved much, just a shift of his head, a tension coming into his shoulders that hadn't been there before. His eyes, when they opened, were a dark amber brown that caught the firelight and held it. He lay still for a moment, taking in the cabin with the controlled, methodical focus of someone trained to assess situations from a position of disadvantage. She watched him work through it, the unfamiliar ceiling, the sounds of wolves breathing around him, the warmth, the smell of broth, the absence of the cold that should have killed him. Then his gaze found her. She met it without looking away. She was too tired for deference right now. She was too tired for anything except the truth of the situation, which was that he was alive because of her, and they both knew it. "You're in my cabin," she said. Her voice came out level, if hoarse. "You've been here since about midnight. You were in hypothermic shutdown when I brought you in. Your pulse is better now. The rest of your group is here too." She gestured at the room without looking away from him. "All 15 of you. They're alive." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, or not just surprise. Something more complex than that, a calculation she couldn't quite read. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was low, roughened by cold and exhaustion, but it carried the same quality as his sleeping face, an authority so habitual it operated without effort. "Mara Vance," she said. "I live here." "Who are you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Alaric," he said. She nodded once, as if a man with a royal seal on his arm giving only a first name was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe, in the privacy of a stranger's cabin after a night of near death, it was. "There's broth," she said, and pushed herself upright with the wall's help because her legs had gone half numb from the cold floor. "I'll heat it. You should eat. All of you should eat when they wake." "Mara." His voice stopped her at the hearth. She looked back. He had pushed himself up onto one arm, and even in that half-raised position, with his hair matted and his face hollowed by cold and exhaustion, there was something in his bearing that made the air around him feel different. She had met alphas before, Roderick, other pack leaders at territory gatherings, and she knew the quality of that particular kind of presence. But she had never felt it quite like this, like a gravity, like weather. "How many of us did you bring in?" 15, she said. He stared at her. The firelight moved across his face. 15, he repeated, quietly, as though tasting the word. "The last 2 were together on the step," she said. "I had to make 2 trips for them." He didn't say anything for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere across the room, one of the other wolves made a low sound as it shifted in its sleep. "You brought us in alone," Alaric said. It wasn't quite a question. "There's no one else," she said. Simply, without complaint or bitterness, just fact, stated as fact, the way she had learned to state things that hurt if she gave them any color. She saw something shift in his expression at that, a tightening around the eyes that could have been anger or grief, or the particular expression a person wears when they understand something they hadn't understood a moment before. "Heat the broth," he said quietly. "Please." She turned back to the fire and did exactly that. Around her, slowly, the other wolves began to wake. By mid-morning, 9 of the 15 had shifted to human form, and Mara's cabin, never spacious to begin with, had become a kind of impossibly crowded shelter that somehow still managed to feel less chaotic than it looked. The wolves who had shifted were alert, if exhausted, and they had arranged themselves with the unconscious efficiency of trained soldiers, the larger ones near the walls and door. The others clustered in the center around the fire, all of them watching Mara with expressions that ranged from cautious gratitude to barely concealed wariness. She ignored the wariness. She'd been looked at that way her whole life by people who had no real reason for it. She could handle wariness from people who'd woken up disoriented in a stranger's cabin. She moved through the space with practiced economy, distributing the broth in the 4 clay bowls she owned. Not enough, obviously, but she heated it in batches and passed the bowls around and nobody complained, which she took as a sign that they understood the situation better than most. The 6 who were still in wolf form had moved closer to the fire and were sleeping in a pile. Their breathing deep and regular now, the dangerous shallow rhythm of the night before replaced by something solid and real. The man called Alaric had said very little since he woke. He had accepted a bowl of broth, drained it in 4 careful swallows, and returned it to her with a brief nod that somehow managed to convey more than a speech. He sat near the door now, his back against the wall, watching his people with the alert, steady attention of someone who had not stopped being a leader even in the worst of it. Occasionally he would say something brief and quiet to one of the others, a question, a direction, and they would respond immediately, the instinctive deference of a well-trained pack. One of the ones who had shifted was a woman, the silver-furred female Mara had nearly lost in the first hour. She was slight for a shifter. Most female pack wolves ran larger than Mara, with a narrow, sharp face and the coloring of someone who had spent most of their life in northern cold. She had given Mara a look when she woke that was different from the others, not wary, not cautious, searching, as though she was trying to figure out something that didn't quite fit into a category she already had. "You're the one who kept my pulse going," the woman said, when Mara paused near her to collect a returned bowl. "Your circulation had stopped in your extremities," Mara said. "I had to work on your legs for about 20 minutes before color came back." "I remember that," the woman said, slowly. "I was conscious enough to feel it. I couldn't respond, but I could feel it." She paused. "I thought I was dreaming." "You weren't." "No." The woman looked at her hands, then back up at Mara. "My name is Vera. I'm captain of the King's Guard." Mara absorbed this without visible reaction. She had already processed, over the course of the night, that the man on her floor was likely more than just a powerful alpha. The seal, the quality of the others' deference, the fact that there were 15 of them moving through Ironwood territory in the worst storm of a generation. Royal Guards didn't travel in small numbers, but they traveled in exactly this configuration when protecting a high-value principle and attempting to move undetected. "How did you end up in the storm?" Mara asked. She kept her voice neutral, not incurious, genuinely wanting to understand, but not pressing. Vera glanced at Alaric. A quick, habitual check-in. He gave a small nod. "We were moving between territories," Vera said. "We had intelligence that suggested our route was secure. The storm projections we'd been given didn't account for how quickly the northern front would move. We were 3 hours from our planned shelter when the whiteout hit." She stopped. Something tightened in her jaw. "We lost the trail almost immediately. The cold—" She stopped again. "We'd been in worse conditions, but not without preparation. We were underprepared for this specific combination of factors." "You were moving without supply cache," Mara said. It wasn't really a question. She'd seen it in the state of them, the absence of gear, the way the hypothermia had progressed faster than it would have if they'd had proper cold weather kit. "Yes." Vera's tone didn't apologize for it, but didn't hide it either. "The storm changed direction about 4 hours in," Mara said. "It came from the northwest instead of due north. Most people's calculations would have been wrong." She said it without judgment. She knew what it was like to face conditions that didn't cooperate with your planning. Across the room, Alaric was watching her. She could feel it without looking. "You knew," he said. Not to Vera, to Mara. She turned to look at him. "I knew it might. My grandmother taught me to watch the specific colors in the northern sky before a front moves. The iron-gray color, she called it. It usually means the direction is less predictable than the forecasts say." "And you prepared for it." "I tried to." She thought of Roderick on the porch, of Senna looking away. "Not as much as I would have liked." Something moved across his face, that same quality she'd seen before, when she'd told him there was no one else. Anger, and something older than anger. "Tell me about this pack," he said quietly. "The Ironwood Wolves." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was beginning, just barely, in the way that made itself known more as an absence of some intensity than as an actual easing to relent. "They're a standard mid-sized territory pack," she said finally. 63 members. Alpha Roderick Hale has led them for 11 years, she paused. "They're organized, functional, as packs go." "And you," Alaric said. His eyes were steady on hers. "Where do you fit in their organization?" She looked at him for a moment, thought about softening it, decided there was no point. "I don't," she said. "Not really. I'm a technical member, born into the territory, never formally expelled, but I've lived here alone since I was 17. They don't—" She stopped, chose words carefully. "They don't consider me a meaningful part of the pack. I'm an Omega, the weakest rank. Roderick decided years ago that I wasn't worth the resources a full pack member requires." The silence that followed had a specific texture to it. It was Vera who broke it. Her voice was careful, but not gentle, the voice of someone who dealt in facts for a living. "You were left here, during a storm that the territory knew was coming." "Yes." "And you—" Vera looked around the cabin, at the empty firewood rack, at the 4 clay bowls, at the blankets spread across the floor, the broken furniture, the smell of broth that had clearly been made from the last of what Mara had. "You used your entire winter store." "I used what was necessary," Mara said. Simply. Another silence. Then Alaric spoke, and his voice had changed. The exhaustion was still in it, but the quality beneath it had shifted, had become something harder and more deliberate, the tone of a man moving from one mode into another. "Mara Vance," he said, "you saved the lives of the Crown. You should know that." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since she'd said, "You're in my cabin," taking in the full weight of what she'd been understanding piece by piece through the night. The seal, the guard, the bearing, the quality of authority that radiated off him, even collapsed on her floor. Seeing it whole. "I saved 15 wolves who were dying on my step," she said. "That's what I know." Something in his expression shifted again, something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. "That's what I know too," he said quietly. "That's exactly what you did." Outside, the storm was still raging, enormous and indifferent, burying the world under white. But inside Mara Vance's small, crowded, exhausted cabin, the fire burned steadily, and 15 lives breathed in the warmth she had refused to let go out, and something had begun, something she didn't have words for yet, that the cold and the dark and everything that had come before had not managed to stop. The storm broke just after noon. Not gently, nothing about that storm had been gentle, but with the abruptness of a door slamming shut, the roaring wind dropping by half in less than 20 minutes, the horizontal snow becoming vertical, then sparse, then still. The silence that replaced it felt enormous. Mara stood at her window and watched the world outside resolve itself from white chaos into something recognizable. Trees bent and loaded with snow, the ground buried past her knee in fresh powder, the sky above clearing from iron gray to a pale, brittle blue that meant the temperature was about to drop another 10 degrees now that the cloud cover was gone. Inside the cabin, the 15 wolves had spent the last few hours in a kind of organized quiet that she had found, without quite expecting to, easier to share space with than she'd anticipated. The Royal Guard, because that was what they were, she had stopped mentally softening the label sometime around dawn, moved and communicated with an efficiency that was almost invisible. Nobody issued orders, nobody jostled for position or space. They simply existed in the cabin around her with a discipline that looked nothing like the aggressive rank performance she'd grown up watching among Ironwood wolves, where every interaction between pack members carried the low electrical charge of dominance and submission, everyone always aware of where they stood and making sure everyone else knew it too. These wolves didn't do that. Or if they did it so subtly she couldn't see the machinery. What she could see was that every one of them, when they needed something or moved through the space she occupied, acknowledged her. A nod, a brief direct look, the kind of eye contact that said, "I see you, you are here, I am aware of your presence in this space." It was such a small thing. She had not realized, until she encountered it over and over through those morning hours, how completely she had been starved of it. The Ironwood wolves had a way of looking through her. Not past her, through her like she was glass, like her presence in a room was a transparent fact that could be acknowledged, or not based purely on whether it was useful at that moment. She had thought she'd grown past caring about it. She was discovering that she had merely grown used to it, which was a different thing entirely. Alaric was on his feet by mid-morning, She had watched him assess his own condition with the brisk efficiency of someone who had taken inventory of his body's capabilities in difficult situations before, testing weight on each leg, rolling his shoulders, checking the range of motion in his arms. He was still pale, the remnants of the cold sitting deep in the color of his skin, but his eyes were sharp and fully present in a way they hadn't been when he first woke. He moved through the cabin checking on his people with a thoroughness that was neither performative nor tender. It was simply thorough, the attention of a person who understood that the people around him were his responsibility and took that understanding seriously. He checked on the 6 who had shifted back to wolf form last, crouching beside each of them in turn. The last was a young male, barely more than a pup, Mara thought, probably his first year in the guard, who had woken briefly around 8 in the morning, accepted a mouthful of broth from a bowl held to his muzzle, and then gone back under. Alaric stayed beside him the longest, one hand resting lightly on the young wolf's shoulder, watching his breathing. When he stood, his face was very still. "He'll recover fully," Mara said from across the room. She had been watching. She couldn't help watching. She had spent the night monitoring all of them, and her body hadn't stopped yet. Alaric looked at her. "You're certain? His color is good. His breathing is even. The shaking stopped 2 hours ago." She paused. "He's young, which works against the cold but works for the recovery. He'll be stiff and hungry and miserable for a few days, but he'll be fine." Something in Alaric's shoulders changed, very slightly. The particular easing of tension that a person allows themselves when someone whose judgment they trust confirms what they had hoped was true. "You know medicine," he said. "My grandmother was the pack healer. She taught me what she knew." Mara began collecting the empty bowls from around the room. "There wasn't much call for an Omega who couldn't hunt, so I learned what I could be useful for instead." She said it without bitterness. Just as a fact, the way she said most things that had bitterness beneath them, so flat and level that the bitterness became almost invisible, detectable only if you were listening for it. Alaric was apparently listening for it. "How long have you lived here alone?" he asked. 5 years? Since you were 17. Since Roderick decided I was a liability." She set the bowls by the hearth. "He didn't expel me formally. Formal expulsion would have required pack council approval, and I don't think he wanted the paperwork of a case that might look unfavorable if anyone outside the territory examined it. He just stopped including me, stopped counting me in the resource distribution, moved my name to the bottom of every list until my name wasn't really on the lists anymore." She glanced at him briefly. "It's a common enough method. Slow exclusion is harder to point at than outright expulsion." "It's cruel," Vera said quietly, from across the room. She had been listening, Mara realized, with the focused attention of someone who was not just hearing a story, but cataloging information. "Yes," Mara said simply. "It is." The words sat in the warm air of the cabin without apology or embellishment. Vera looked at Alaric. Alaric looked at Mara. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now. What did last night cost you?" She almost deflected. The reflex was so trained in her, "I'm fine, it's nothing, don't worry about it," that she had the words half-formed before she caught herself and did what her grandmother had always told her she was bad at. She told the truth. "Most of my winter food store. About a third of my firewood." She paused. "The furniture I burned can be replaced. The food is the more immediate problem. I have enough for myself for maybe another week, but the storm likely collapsed the snare lines I had set to the east, and rebaiting them will take time, and the deer will have moved lower and farther during the blizzard." "We'll provide for it," Alaric said. Immediately, without consultation or calculation, the way someone makes a commitment when the rightness of it isn't in question. "Everything you used, everything the night cost you, it will be returned." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know. I didn't help you expecting I know that too." His voice was quiet, but completely certain. "That's partly why I'm telling you." She didn't have an answer for that. She turned back to the hearth and added a piece of birch to the fire, and let the small complicated warmth of being seen by someone move through her without making a sound. But the decision to move came 2 hours after the storm broke. It wasn't entirely optional. The temperature outside was dropping fast. She had checked it by the thickness of the new frost forming on her window, a rough but reliable method her grandmother had taught her. And while the cabin had held through the blizzard, there were new sounds in the walls now, new settling creaks that she didn't entirely trust. The south wall crack had widened overnight. More pressingly, she had counted the remaining firewood twice, and the math was not favorable. 15 bodies, even recovering wolves who burned fuel efficiently, were going to outpace what remained before nightfall. She had told Alaric this with the direct brevity she was developing a habit of around him. She had noticed over the course of the morning that he preferred directness, that he responded to it with the same quality, that talking to him involved none of the constant social calculation she performed with most people, the measuring of how much was safe to say. It was a relief she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. "The royal shelter is 3 hours east on a clear day," Vera had said when Alaric laid out the situation to the assembled group. The 6 wolves who had been in wolf form were now all upright, still exhausted, still running below full capacity, but ambulatory and oriented. 13 of the 15 were in human form. In current conditions, with the snow depth and the wind chill, 5 hours, said one of the guards, a heavy-set man named Cutter, whose voice had the quality of someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors making practical assessments. "Maybe 5.5, if we move steady." "The young one can't walk 5 hours, Mara said. Everyone looked at her. She had become, she realized, someone whose contributions to these conversations were now listened to as a matter of course. When had that happened, exactly? Sometime in the night, she thought. Sometime between the first scratch at the door and the morning light, she had become a person in this group whose voice was part of the calculation. "Dane can walk," said the young guard himself. He had shifted back to human form an hour ago, and he was sitting upright and making a visible effort to demonstrate exactly that. His face was paper white, and there was a fine tremor in his hands that he was trying to hide by pressing them flat against his thighs. "You can walk 20 minutes, Mara said. Not unkindly, but not softly either. In these conditions, with the snow depth, exertion in a body that's still in hypothermic recovery can trigger a secondary crisis. You're not stable enough for a 5-hour trek." Dane looked at her. He was young enough that the effort to hide his fear was only partially successful. It showed around his eyes, in the tightness of his jaw. "What's the alternative?" "He needs to stay warm for at least another 6 hours before he attempts anything strenuous," Mara said to Alaric. "But I've already told you the firewood situation." There was a pause, the kind that meant everyone in the room had arrived at the same calculation and was waiting for someone to say the answer out loud. "The Ironwood Lodge," Vera said flatly. "It's closer." "Yes," Mara said. "About 40 minutes on foot, maybe an hour in current snow depth." "But the pack," one of the other guards began. "The pack will accommodate the King's Guard," Vera said, and her tone was not asking. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about Roderick on the porch, about the flat nothing of his regard, about walking toward that lodge with these people, with the knowledge that last night he had known the storm was coming and had left her, and that walking back there now meant standing in the same space as that knowledge made visible. "Mara," Alaric's voice. She looked at him. "You don't have to come. We can find the lodge from your directions." "You'd lose the trail in 40 minutes, she said. "The storm rerouted the drifts. The path I know doesn't look like a path anymore." "Then tell me how to—" "I'll take you," she said. And that was the end of that. She led them out into a world remade. The storm had transformed the forest into something that bore only approximate resemblance to what it had been the day before. Trees that she knew by their bark and the angle of their lean were buried to half their height in new snow. The trail she had walked hundreds of times, worn enough that she could follow it half asleep, had been entirely erased, replaced by a smooth white surface with no feature or reference she could read except the shape of the land beneath it and the spacing of the trees on either side. She read those things well. She always had. Her grandmother had walked her through this forest in every season and every kind of weather, teaching her to read the landscape's bones rather than its surface, to navigate by the things that didn't change rather than the things that did. She moved through this buried forest with a steadiness that was not confidence exactly. Confidence implied certainty, and she had a precise, honest relationship with uncertainty, but was something else. trust in her own accumulated knowledge, faith in the things she had been taught by someone who had never lied to her about the difficulty of the world or the tools required to survive it. Behind her, the 15 wolves moved in a loose column, the guards spacing themselves instinctively, the two largest flanking the center where Alaric and Vera walked. Dane was being supported between two of the bigger guards, his feet moving but his weight shared. He was complying with this without protest, which told her he felt worse than his face was showing. She checked the pace against that, slowed it a fraction. Alaric fell into step beside her. He did it quietly, without announcement, and she adjusted without comment, a small recalibration of her awareness to include his presence at her left shoulder. He was silent for a while. They moved through the trees with the specific white silence of post-storm air, the world around them muffled and strange, their breathing the loudest sound. "How long have you known this forest?" he asked eventually. "My whole life. My grandmother's cabin was my grandmother's mother's before her. My family has been in this territory for 4 generations. And the pack? The pack has been here longer, but my family predates Roderick's line by 2 generations." She paused on the crest of a small rise, checking the angle of the tree line against her mental map. "Left here. The drainage ditch runs under that spruce stand and the ground is more solid above it." He followed her left without hesitation. "Does it matter to you?" he asked. "The history, that your family was here first." She thought about it honestly. No. History doesn't override present reality. What matters is how things are now, not how they got there. A pause. "But it does matter that Roderick knows it, that he knows my grandmother built half the preserving knowledge that Pack depends on every winter, and he still—" She stopped. "No. I said history doesn't matter. I meant it." "You can be angry," Alaric said quietly. "It's not inconsistent." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the forest ahead, not her, giving her the space of not being watched while he said it. "I'm not angry," she said. And then, because the cold and the exhaustion and the strangeness of the last 18 hours had stripped away some of her usual careful management of herself. "I'm tired. Angry takes too much energy. Being tired is just honest." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the most efficient description of grief I've ever heard," he said. She almost stopped walking, almost looked at him fully. Instead, she kept moving and said nothing, because she didn't have the words yet for what his saying that had done inside her chest. She heard the Ironwood Lodge before she saw it. Voices first, the specific quality of many people in an enclosed, warm space, the sound of a community that had come through the storm intact and was now at the comfortable stage of aftermath, the shared meals, the inventory of damage, the collective relief that loosened tongues and made people louder than usual. Then the smell of wood smoke, rich and steady, a fire that had never been allowed to falter. Then through the trees, the warm yellow squares of the lodge windows, and the dark bulk of the building itself, its roof buried under 2 feet of snow that nobody had bothered to clear yet. She stopped at the tree line and looked at it. She had not walked up to the Ironwood Lodge as anything other than a supplicant in 5 years. Every visit had been the same pattern: approach, wait to be acknowledged, state her need as briefly and non-intrusively as possible, receive whatever was or wasn't given, retreat. The geometry of it was so ingrained that she could feel it in her body now. The slight forward curve of her shoulders, the careful neutrality of her expression, the automatic tamping down of whatever she was actually feeling into something small and manageable and non-threatening. She straightened her shoulders. It was a small thing, a physical decision, but it felt like something larger. "This is it," she said to Alaric at her shoulder. "It is," he agreed. And something in his tone told her he had seen the pause, had seen what happened in her face before she straightened, had understood it without needing it explained. She walked out of the tree line and toward the lodge door. She was halfway across the yard when it opened. Denny Wolfe, Roderick's enforcer, broad-faced and currently wearing the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting cold air and found something entirely else, stood in the doorframe and stared at her. His eyes moved from Mara to the column of wolves emerging from the tree line behind her, his face cycling through confusion, surprise, and then the specific blankness of someone recalibrating very quickly. "Mara," he said. The way he said it had the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure what the correct register was yet. Last time he'd talked to her, he'd laughed at her in front of Roderick. She could see him thinking about that. "Denny," she said, "we need to come in. I have injured people." "Who are they?" "We need to come in," she repeated. Level. Not asking. He stepped back. Whether from her tone or from the visual weight of 14 other wolves at her back, 14 wolves moving with the particular organized calm of trained fighters, she didn't know and didn't care. She walked through the door. The interior of the Ironwood Lodge hit her like a physical sensation. Warmth. Real warmth. The deep, baked-in warmth of a fire that had been burning for days in a properly insulated building, and the smell of food and bodies and wood smoke, the animal comfort of a pack in winter shelter. She had not been inside this building in nearly 3 years. Every face in the room turned to look at her. There were 40 or 50 wolves in the main hall, most of the pack, gathered around the long tables and the central hearth. She knew almost all of them, had grown up alongside many of them, had been invisible to most of them for 5 years. She saw the recognition move through the room in a wave. Mara. It's Mara. Why is Mara here? And behind it, the other wave. Who are those people with her? Who are all those people? Roderick Hale was standing at the far end of the hall. He had clearly been in the middle of a conversation. He was half turned toward the person he'd been speaking with, a cup in his hand, in the relaxed posture of a man managing his pack's post-storm recovery with comfortable authority. He turned fully when the room's attention shifted, saw Mara, and his expression did the thing she knew it would do. It went flat. That nothing expression, that glass look. Then his gaze moved to what was behind her, and the nothing expression fractured. "Alpha Hale," Mara said, crossing the hall with the steadiness she had decided on at the tree line. She stopped in the center of the room, in front of his table, where everyone could hear. "I'm bringing injured wolves who need shelter and warmth. I request the use of your fire and whatever medical stores the pack has." "Mara!" Roderick's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the machinery working in it, the calculation of who these strangers were and what their presence meant, running fast underneath the surface. "They came through the storm," she said. "They were in hypothermic shutdown when they reached me. I sheltered them through the night, but the young one needs more time before he can travel further." "Who are they?" Not a question, a demand, sharp and flat. "My name," said Alaric's voice from behind her, carrying across the entire hall with the kind of effortless projection that came not from volume but from weight, "is Alaric Nightfall." The silence that followed was the kind that Mara had only experienced once or twice in her life. The silence of a room full of people whose collective understanding of a situation had just been entirely overturned, everyone arriving simultaneously at the same recalculation, nobody speaking because there was a half-second moment where all of them needed to just absorb. Alaric Nightfall, King of the Northern Territories, High Alpha of the Council of Crowns, the man whose mark on a letter made governors move and whose name in a formal declaration changed laws. Standing in the Ironwood Lodge, behind Mara Vance. Roderick set down his cup with a click that sounded very loud in the silence. "Your Majesty," he said. The flatness in his voice had become something else. Not warmth, because Roderick Hale was not a man who did warmth easily, but a very different kind of careful control. The control of someone managing exposure to an unexpected threat. "We had no word of your—" "No," Alaric said pleasantly. "You wouldn't have." He crossed the room at Mara's side and stopped across the table from Roderick, and the quality of him in this space, his height, the authority that moved with him like a second skin, made the lodge feel smaller. "My guard and I were rerouted by the storm. We found ourselves at the edge of your territory." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. "At one of your pack's cabins." Something moved in Roderick's jaw. Barely visible, but visible. "We're grateful for your hospitality," Alaric continued, and his tone was perfectly, exactly civil. The kind of civil that had nothing warm in it, the kind that was made entirely of precision, and said, without saying, that he was aware of everything and had decided what to do about it, but was not doing it yet. "Particularly as your pack member was so generous with her resources." "Your pack member." Mara heard the phrase and understood exactly what Alaric had done with it, had taken Roderick's own language, the formal structure of pack belonging, and turned it back like a mirror. If Mara was his pack member, then what had happened to her was Roderick's responsibility. If she was his responsibility, and she had been living alone for 5 years on the pack's margins with inadequate support, Roderick understood it too. She could see it in the micro-expression that crossed his face before he controlled it. "Of course," he said. "Miss Vance is, yes, a valued member of our pack." The lie was so fluid and reflexive that Mara almost admired the mechanics of it. Not the lie itself. She felt the old anger stir at the sound of it. The specific anger of having your truth rewritten out loud in front of you. But the speed of it, the way a man like Roderick could reconstruct reality in the same breath as breathing. She did not look away from him. She stood very still and let him say it, and watched his eyes and let him see that she was watching. "I'm sure she is," Alaric said, and his tone was so smooth and so perfectly agreeable that only someone paying very close attention would have caught the thing underneath it, the thing that was not agreeable at all. "We'll need a room for the injured guard," Vera said, stepping forward with the brisk efficiency of someone moving a conversation from politics to logistics, "and medical supplies. Clean bandages, any anti-inflammatory herbs the pack healer has, and a sustained heat source." "Of course," Roderick said again. He snapped his fingers at Denny, who was hovering near the door with the expression of a man who had watched a conversation go several directions he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure which way to look. "Get Senna. Tell her to bring the medical kit." While the lodge reorganized itself around the logistics of accommodating 15 additional wolves, with the particular frenzy of a pack that was trying to perform hospitality for a king on no notice, Mara stood in the center of the hall and watched the faces of people she had known for her entire life process the situation. She could see the calculations running, could see the way they looked at her, really looked at her, some of them for the first time in years, and then looked at Alaric, and then looked at her again, with an expression she recognized as the specific social recalibration of people who had built their understanding of another person's worth entirely on the consensus opinion of those above them, and were now discovering that consensus had just been publicly complicated. Senna came through the back door with the medical kit. She stopped when she saw Mara. Her face was difficult to read. Senna's face had always been difficult to read. She deployed a careful pleasantness over everything the way some people used armor, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "Mara," she said. "Senna." Mara nodded once. "There's a young guard who needs your attention. Recovering hypothermia, secondary stabilization stage. He has enough core warmth, but his extremities are still compromised, and he needs monitoring for the next 6 hours. Senna blinked. Then she shifted smoothly into healer mode. It was what she was good at, always had been, and Mara had always respected it, even when she had trouble respecting much else about the woman. "Show me." Mara led her to where Dane had been settled near the main hearth, one of the guards staying close on his other side. She ran through what she'd done through the night. The circulation work, the broth, the warming sequence, and Senna listened with a focused attention that temporarily suspended everything else between them, because medicine was like that. A space where the only relevant question was the patient in front of you and what they needed. "You did everything right," Senna said quietly when Mara finished. "I know," Mara said, without arrogance, just simply. Senna looked at her for a moment. "The storm," she began. "I have enough firewood to get through the week," Mara said. The lie came out without premeditation. She would figure out whether it was actually a lie later. "I'm fine." "Mara?" "Take care of the boy," Mara said, and stepped back. She was crossing the hall toward the hearth when she heard Roderick's voice behind her, low and controlled, directed at someone beside him, not at her, not intending to be overheard. The acoustics of the stone-floored hall and 5 years of practice at listening to conversations she wasn't meant to hear delivered it to her anyway. "Find out who she is to him," Roderick said. "Find out how long they were together before we got here. And find out," a pause, his voice dropping further but not far enough, "what she told them." Mara kept walking. Her face stayed exactly where she had put it, still, neutral, the glass face she had built for exactly these moments. But her hands, hanging at her sides, had curled into fists so slowly and so completely that her knuckles had gone white. She uncurled them, finger by finger, deliberately. Not yet, she told herself. Not here. Not like this. She reached the hearth and stopped, staring into the fire. The ironwood flames were the same color as her own, the same orange gold, built from the same kind of birch that grew on both sides of the territory. Fire was like that. It didn't know who deserved its warmth and who didn't. It just burned for whoever was standing close enough. She heard footsteps behind her. Not Alaric's. She had already learned the rhythm of his steps, the specific weight distribution of them, the way he moved. These were different. It was Vera who stopped beside her. "He's going to be a problem," Vera said quietly, looking into the fire the same way Mara was. "He's been a problem for 5 years," Mara said. "He'll keep." "For now," Vera agreed, and then, after a pause, "For now." They stood side by side in front of the ironwood fire, the captain of the King's Guard and the Omega, who had kept her heart beating through the worst night of a generation, and didn't say anything else. Outside, the sky was the particular sharp blue of post-storm cold, brittle and clear and indifferent, and the world was very white and very quiet. It lasted until Roderick's voice rose across the hall, calling for the evening meal to be set, welcoming, loudly, for everyone to hear, his royal guest to the ironwood table. Mara listened to the warmth in his performance, the ease of it, the way a man could arrange his face and his voice into the shape of generosity and stand inside that shape without it costing him a thing, because the shape was all that was required of him, and the truth of what lay underneath it didn't matter as long as the performance was good enough. She was quiet on the outside. On the inside, something that had been patient for 5 years was becoming, slowly and with great precision, done with patience. She turned from the fire and took her place at the table, not at the end, where she had always been seated when she'd been permitted to sit at all. She sat where there was space, in the middle of the long bench, between two of the guards, who had shifted down to make room for her without being asked. She picked up a bowl and ladled stew into it and sat very straight, and when Roderick's gaze found her from across the table, she met it without looking away. His eyes narrowed, barely, but she saw it. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was, for Mara Vance, approximately 3 seconds longer than she had allowed herself in 5 years. And then she turned to the guard on her left and asked him a quiet question about the condition of the young man by the hearth. The guard answered her, warmly, treating her like a person. It shouldn't have been extraordinary. It wasn't extraordinary. It was the bare minimum of human interaction, the basic acknowledgement that another person in a room is a person. And yet the feeling of it moved through her like heat through cold hands, slow and slightly painful and deeply, stubbornly necessary. Across the table, Roderick was smiling at something the Alpha to his right had said. The smile looked real. It looked like the smile of a man who was confident in his standing, comfortable in his lodge, untroubled by the presence of an Omega and a king eating at the same table. Mara watched the smile and thought about what she had heard him say. Find out what she told them. He was afraid. Not of her. He had never been afraid of her, and that was part of the problem, part of what had made the 5 years possible. But of the information she might carry. Of what 15 nights' worth of quiet, exhausted, unguarded conversation in a warm cabin might have produced between a king and an Omega. Of what she might have said and what he might have believed. He should be afraid of that. She had not, in fact, told Alaric much. She had answered questions when asked, directly and without embellishment, because she was not a person who embellished. But the truth, when stated plainly and without embellishment, had a weight of its own. She had told it, and it had been heard, and what a man like Alaric did with the things he heard was not something Roderick Hale had any control over. The meal continued around her, loud and warm and performing normalcy. She ate steadily and didn't speak unless spoken to and kept her face arranged in its most neutral setting. But her mind was working. It had been working since midnight, and it showed no signs of stopping. Outside, the last light left the post-storm sky in a slow fade from blue to black, and the temperature outside the lodge walls dropped past the point where any wolf caught unprepared would not survive an hour. Inside, the fire burned and the voices rose and fell, and the evening moved forward. It was, on the surface, a night like any other. Under the surface, everything had already changed. She found out what had changed at exactly the moment she was least prepared for it. She had stepped outside, briefly, just for the cold air and the space and the absence of performance, and was standing on the lodge porch watching the stars appear through the last shreds of cloud when she heard the door open behind her. Alaric. She knew before she turned. He came to stand beside her, and they were quiet for a moment, both looking at the emerging stars, the way you can be quiet with someone when the last 18 hours have already used up the formal beginning stages of knowing a person. Vera ran the seal check, he said after a while. She turned to look at him. The what? When we arrive at an unfamiliar pack's territory, Vera assesses it. Pack composition, social structure, signs of internal conflict or maladministration. He was looking at the stars, not at her. It's standard practice. We've been doing it since we entered Ironwood territory. And the picture she's assembled is... He paused, choosing words with the care of a man who uses language precisely, not favorable to Alpha Hale. Mara was very still. There are 6 other Omegas in this pack, he continued. 3 of them are in situations that Vera describes as parallel to yours, technically members, functionally marginalized, living in inadequate conditions without appropriate pack support. A pause. The documentation of resource distribution over the last 5 years shows a consistent pattern of allocation that concentrates resources among high-ranking members and systematically underprovides for lower-ranked wolves. I know, Mara said quietly. I know you know, he said. That's not why I'm telling you. He turned to look at her then, fully, with those amber dark eyes that held the firelight from the windows and something else underneath it, something deliberate and careful and very serious. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that what happens next is not informal. It's not a favor, and it's not a matter of personal discomfort on my part. He held her gaze. What happens next is the law, and the law requires witnesses who are willing to speak. The cold air moved between them, sharp and clean. You're asking me to testify, she said. I'm asking if you're willing to, he said. There's a difference. She looked at him. At the steadiness of him, the weight of what he was carrying in that straightforward, direct regard, the knowledge that he was standing in front of her not as someone who needed something from her, but as someone who was offering her something, a mechanism, a system, a hand that was extended not as charity but as the basic working of a justice that she had spent 5 years believing didn't apply to people like her. What will it cost me? She asked, because she was not naive enough to not ask. Something moved in his face, not surprise but a kind of recognition, the expression of a man who respects a question. You'll have to stand in front of the High Council. You'll have to say what happened to you, on record, with Hale in the same room. And if the council decides against the council will not decide against, he said. Simply. Not as reassurance. As fact. The fact of a man who knows his counsel and what the evidence will show and what the outcome of that evidence will be. But I'm not asking you to trust that. I'm asking you to decide whether you are willing to speak your truth in front of people who have the power to act on it, regardless of outcome. She was quiet for a long moment. The stars were out fully now. The kind of sharp, brilliant winter stars that only appeared when the air was absolutely clean, when everything had been scoured clear by the storm, when the world was cold enough and clear enough that the light from very far away could travel to you without obstruction. Yes, she said. One word, completely without hesitation, arriving from a place that didn't require deliberation, the place where a decision had already been made so long ago that when the moment finally arrived for it, it was simply waiting there, ready. Yes, she said again, because it deserved to be said twice. Alaric was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a single, slow nod, the kind that means, I hear you, I will hold this, I will not waste it. Then we leave for the capital at first light, he said. All of us. He went back inside. Mara stayed on the porch a while longer, in the cold and the starlight, and felt something very old and very compressed inside her chest begin, slowly, to loosen. She went back inside before the cold had finished working through her coat. The lodge was settling into its evening rhythm, the particular winding down quality of a large group of people who had come through a crisis and were now in the gradual decompression of aftermath. Conversations had dropped in volume. Children who had been wound tight with storm energy were now sleeping in the back rooms. The fire had been banked for the night, its light lower and steadier, painting everything in amber tones that made the hall look warmer and more unified than the reality warranted. Mara moved through it quietly. She was good at moving through spaces without disturbing them. Years of practice at being someone nobody wanted to notice had given her a particular quality of stillness in crowds, the ability to pass through a room's social fabric without snagging it. She found a spot near the far wall, away from the main cluster of bodies, and sat with her back against the stone and her knees drawn up and tried to process what had just happened on the porch in the clean, functional way she processed most things, by breaking it into its components and examining each piece separately before putting them back together. Alaric Nightfall had asked her to testify before the High Council. She had said yes. She ran the implications of that the way she ran a firewood calculation, methodically, without flinching from the numbers that didn't favor her. Standing before the High Council meant leaving Ironwood territory, possibly permanently. It meant having her account of the last 5 years entered into the formal record of a governing body that had the power to act on it. It meant looking at Roderick Hale across a council chamber and saying out loud, clearly, with her name attached, everything that had been done and not done, and taken and withheld. It meant being believed or not being believed, with consequences in either direction that were larger than anything she had navigated before. What surprised her was not that she had said yes. What surprised her was how quickly she had said it, and how little fear had been involved. She probed at that, turning it over, looking for the place where the fear should be. She found something else instead, a quality she recognized from the night before, from the moment she had opened her door into the blizzard and begun dragging cold wolves inside. The same clarity. The same complete absence of the second-guessing that ordinarily ran as background noise in everything she did. The feeling of a decision that had already been made so long ago that arriving at it felt less like a choice than a recognition. She was still sitting there, very still, when Senna sat down beside her. Not near her. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, the way people sat when they wanted to say something that required proximity, when the words were the kind that lost something if they had to travel too far. Mara waited. "I knew," Senna said, quietly, into the middle distance, not at Mara. "I knew it was wrong. What he did to you. What I let happen by not saying anything." Mara didn't answer immediately. She looked at the side of Senna's face, the careful neutrality of it, the specific effort it was costing her to hold that neutrality while saying this, and the smaller, more genuine thing working underneath it. Senna Cole had always been two people in one body, and the one Mara had liked years ago was the smaller one, the one that showed up in moments like this, private moments, low-stakes moments, moments when the performance of rank didn't require maintenance. "I know you knew," Mara said finally. "I'm sorry," Senna said. "I know that too." A pause. "Is that enough?" Senna asked, and there was something raw in it. Not performed contrition, but the real question, the one that didn't have a comfortable answer. Mara thought about it, gave it the consideration it deserved rather than the reflexive reassurance that would have been easier. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. "Ask me again in a year." Senna let out a slow breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Something in between. "Fair," she said. They sat together in the amber firelight of the Ironwood Lodge. Two women who had once been something like friends, and had been something like strangers for 5 years, and were now in the uncertain, tentative territory between those two things, and neither of them pushed it further than that. Sometimes the acknowledgement was what mattered. Sometimes it was enough to sit close and let the silence hold what the words couldn't. Across the room, Roderick Hale was watching them. Mara felt it before she saw it. The specific quality of being watched by someone who is trying not to appear to be watching, that faint prickling at the edge of awareness. She turned her head slowly and found his gaze across the room. He looked away immediately, smoothly, redirecting his attention to the conversation he was nominally part of. But she had seen it, and he had seen her see it. Something moved in her stomach, not fear. Closer to the alertness that comes before fear, the animal awareness of a situation beginning to shift toward danger, the body's earliest warning system activating before the mind is caught up to the reason why. He's calculating something. She didn't know what yet, but she had lived around Roderick Hale long enough to read the particular quality of his stillness, the way he got very controlled and very deliberate when he was moving through a problem he considered serious. He was not a man given to impulsive action. He planned. He positioned. He worked through scenarios with the patient thoroughness of someone who had held power for 11 years by being very careful about when and how he applied pressure. He was being very careful right now. She filed the observation away and didn't let it show in her face. She woke before dawn to the sound of movement. The lodge had quieted hours ago. Most bodies asleep in the main hall or the back rooms, the fire burned to low coals. She had slept in the hall, not wanting a room, had wrapped herself in her own coat and sat against the wall and slid into a light, surface-level sleep that was more rest than recovery. The kind of sleep she'd learned in the cabin, where you didn't go too deep because deep sleep in a questionable situation was a liability. The movement was outside. She was certain of it before she was fully awake. Her body had already processed the sound and assigned it a category before her conscious mind caught up. Footsteps. More than one person. The particular crunch of compressed snow under a deliberate weight, moving away from the lodge toward the eastern tree line. The eastern tree line. The direction of her cabin. She was on her feet and at the door in 15 seconds. Outside, the pre-dawn air was absolute zero, the sharp, killing cold of a cleared winter sky before the sun had touched it, the kind that hurt your lungs on the first breath and made the inside of your nose feel scraped raw. She stood on the porch and listened. The footsteps had stopped or moved beyond the range of the ambient noise to suppress, but she could see them in the moonlight, 2 sets of tracks, fresh, leading east. She went back inside and crossed directly to where Vera was sleeping. Vera woke the way trained soldiers woke, fully, immediately, with no transition period. Her eyes were open and oriented before Mara had finished crouching beside her. "Someone left the lodge heading east," Mara said, very quietly, "toward my cabin." Vera was already sitting up. "How long ago?" "Minutes." "How many?" "2 sets of tracks." Vera looked at her for a single second, assessing, and then she was standing, pulling on her outer layer with the practiced speed of someone who had dressed under pressure before. "Wake no one else. Come with me." "Why?" "Because you know the terrain, and I don't." A pause. "And because whatever they're going to do, I want a witness who has standing." Mara didn't ask what she meant by that. She pulled on her coat and followed. They moved fast and quiet through the tree line, Mara reading the trail by moonlight with the ease of long familiarity. Every dip and rise of the ground under the snow, every landmark tree, the angle of the terrain that meant the drainage hollow was 30 feet to the left, even though you couldn't see it. The tracks ahead of them were fresh and easy to follow. 2 sets of large boot prints moving with purpose. No hesitation in the stride, knowing where they were going. Her cabin. She was certain of it 10 minutes before they reached it. The certainty settled into her stomach like a stone. She thought about what was in the cabin. Her grandmother's cedar chest, the spare wool blankets, the carefully folded herbs, the small leather-bound record book where her grandmother had kept 40 years of medicinal knowledge in handwriting so small it required squinting. The preserving jars along the east wall, the ones that hadn't been emptied during the night. The snare materials, the hand hatchet. Nothing of monetary value by any external measure. Nothing Roderick would want for practical reasons. But there was something else in the cabin. Something she had been so focused on the 15 wolves and the broth and the firewood that she hadn't thought about until this moment. Her grandmother's formal documents, the territorial claim papers, 4 generations of inheritance records signed by every alpha who had led Ironwood territory going back to the founding. Documents that proved, in the language of pack law, that the cabin and its land were hers by right of continuous family occupancy, independent of pack membership. Documents that would matter significantly if a formal investigation into Ironwood Territory's resource distribution practices began to examine who owned what. Documents that Roderick would want destroyed before morning. She started running. Vera matched her pace without question, no words exchanged, just two people moving fast through the dark forest, the cold ripping at their faces, their breath coming in white plumes that the moonlight turned ghostly. The trees blurred on either side. The snow caught and dragged at their legs with every stride, the depth of it making the run feel like fighting through water. She heard the cabin before she saw it, a sound she recognized, the specific splintering crack of her front door being forced. She came out of the tree line at a dead run. Two figures, large, pack enforcers. She knew both of them by shape before she was close enough to see their faces. Denny Wolf was inside. She could see him through the open door frame, moving along the east wall with a torch in one hand, his other hand already reaching toward the cedar chest. The second enforcer, Cade, a big, unimaginative man who did what Roderick told him with the mechanical reliability of a well-maintained piece of equipment, was standing in the doorway as watch. He turned when he heard her coming. Mara. She didn't slow down. She hit the doorframe at full speed, grabbed it with both hands to redirect her momentum, and pushed past him into the cabin before his reaction time had processed her presence. Denny, step away from that chest. Denny turned. He had the torch raised and the chest half open. His face moved through surprise, annoyance, and then settled into the calculated blankness of a man deciding how much the situation required him to care about her objection. She watched the calculation run. Omega, female, alone, no real authority, and saw it arrive at the answer that Roderick had apparently been relying on for 5 years. Alpha's orders, Denny said. We're clearing your cabin of pack-owned materials. Nothing in this cabin is pack-owned, Mara said. Alpha says different. The Alpha doesn't have the authority to make that determination unilaterally. Her voice was completely steady. She was standing between Denny and the cedar chest, which meant she was standing between Denny and the torch was very close to her coat. She was aware of that. She stayed anyway. Those documents are registered inheritance papers under territorial law. They predate Roderick Hale's leadership by 60 years. He has no claim on them. You're going to lecture me on territorial law? Denny's voice had taken on the particular quality of a man who finds the situation mildly amusing rather than genuinely challenging, the tone of someone who doesn't believe the obstacle in front of him is real. He took a step toward the chest. I am, said Vera's voice from the doorway. Denny stopped. Vera stepped into the cabin with the absolute, unhurried calm of someone who has never once in her life needed to raise her voice to be the most authoritative presence in a room. She was smaller than either enforcer, lighter, and she moved like every ounce of her was organized around a single, clear purpose. My name is Vera Thane, she said, Captain of the King's Guard, and I will now explain to you very precisely the legal situation you are currently in. She held Denny's gaze with a directness that was neither hostile nor warm. It was, Mara thought, the purest form of professional authority she had ever witnessed. You are in the private dwelling of a territorial pack member who has not consented to your presence. You are in possession of a lit torch in that dwelling. You have been acting on the verbal order of a pack alpha in a matter that falls under the jurisdiction of the Crown Council due to our presence in this territory. And you have been witnessed in this action by a member of the King's Guard and by the pack member herself. A silence. Meaning, Cade said from the doorway, because Cade was not a subtle man and subtlety had apparently not reached him. Meaning, Vera said, that the next decision you make will be the one this situation is remembered by. I suggest you make it carefully. Denny looked at the torch in his hand, at the cedar chest, at Vera, at Mara. And that last look was different from the others because Mara was looking back at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. An expression that had nothing deferential or apologetic or diminished in it, just a clear-eyed steadiness that said she was not moving and would not be moved. He lowered the torch. We were just checking on... He started. You're leaving, Vera said. Not angrily, just stating a fact, the way you state that the temperature is dropping or the storm has passed. You're leaving right now, and when you return to the lodge, you will say nothing about this to Alpha Hale until I have spoken with the king. Do you understand? Another silence. Denny's jaw was working through something, anger or the particular humiliation of a man who has had his authority negated so cleanly that there's no angle left to come back at. Then he walked past Vera to the door. Cade moved out of his way. They left. Mara let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. "The documents," Vera said, once the sound of their footsteps had faded. Mara crossed to the cedar chest and opened it fully. The papers were there, exactly where her grandmother had kept them, folded in oilskin and tied with a strip of leather, the pack of them thick and heavy with accumulated years. She pulled them out, checked the ties, held them for a moment with both hands. Her grandmother had spent 20 years building this. 20 years of careful record-keeping, of formal registrations, of navigating the bureaucracy of territorial law to ensure that what she built could not be taken from whoever came after her. She had not done it expecting Roderick. She had not known what was coming. She had simply understood, with the pragmatic foresight of a woman who had watched enough of the world to know that what was informal could always be made formal in someone else's favor. That protection required documentation. "You can't carry everything in your head," her grandmother had said. "Put the important things on paper and the paper in a place the fire can't reach." "Can I leave these with you?" Mara asked Vera. Vera looked at the oilskin packet. "Yes," she said. "I'll carry them personally." Mara placed them in her hands. Then she looked around her cabin. At the swept floor and the careful organization of her shelves, the grandmother's herbs hung in their bundles from the ceiling beam, the single chair remaining by the hearth, the 4 clay bowls washed and stacked, the sleeping mat rolled and tied. Everything arranged with the careful economy of a person who has always had exactly enough space and nothing extra, and has learned to make that feel like sufficiency. She had not decided to leave this cabin, not consciously, not formally, but standing in it now, after everything, she felt the particular quality of a space that had held you as long as it could, that had done its work, and was ready to let you go. "Let's go back," she said. The lodge was beginning to wake by the time they returned. The first gray light of true dawn was coming over the eastern ridge, thin and cold and clean, and the sounds of the building stirring carried into the yard. The early risers starting the morning fire, the low voices of people emerging from sleep. Mara and Vera came through the door without announcing themselves and moved directly to where Alaric was already awake, standing near the main hearth with a cup and the expression of a man who had not slept as much as he'd appeared to. He looked at Vera, then at Mara, then at the oilskin packet in Vera's hands. "Tell me," he said. Vera told him. The telling was brief and exact. The tracks, the cabin, the torch, the confrontation, the documents. Vera told it the way she told everything, with the precise, uninflected efficiency of a woman whose job required accurate reporting over colorful description. Mara stood beside her and added nothing, because Vera had missed nothing. When it was done, Alaric set down his cup. The movement was very controlled. The cup was set down exactly, not placed but positioned, and his hand left it with a deliberateness that was the only visible indicator of what was happening underneath his expression. His face was still. His eyes, looking across the hall to where Roderick Hale had just appeared in the doorway of the back corridor, were completely clear. "He was going to destroy your inheritance records," Alaric said, quietly. Not to Vera, to Mara. "Yes. Before we left, before we reached the capital. Before there was a formal record of anything requiring investigation," Mara said. "Without those documents, my claim to the cabin's land is informal. Pack disputed. Roderick could argue I've been squatting on Pack territory for 5 years, which would reframe everything you told me last night," Alaric said. "Make your account look like a dispossessed squatter's grievance, rather than an Omega's testimony about systematic negligence." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Across the hall, Roderick had seen them. He had assessed the group, Alaric, Vera, Mara, the oilskin packet, and his face had done something very brief and very controlled, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second before his performance reasserted itself. He started across the hall with the steady, measured pace of a man approaching a conversation he had decided on the terms for in advance. "Your Majesty," he said, stopping 2 feet away, pitched to the warm and hospitable register he'd been deploying since they arrived. "I hope you slept well. We'll have a morning meal ready shortly. Roderick." Alaric's voice was absolutely conversational. "Tell me about the 2 men you sent to Mara's cabin this morning." The pause lasted exactly 1 second. I'm not sure what you... The two men. The torch. The cedar chest. Alaric picked up his cup again calmly. I'd like to hear your version of it. The hall was awake now, had been gradually filling during this exchange, pack members moving through their morning routines, but drawn, with the inexorable social gravity of a community that sensed something significant happening, toward the center of the room. 40 wolves, more or less, in various states of morning preparedness, all within earshot. Mara felt the weight of that, felt it on her skin, that old familiar sensation of being looked at by people who had written her off, except now the looking had a different quality, uncertain, recalibrating. I sent them to secure pack property, Roderick said. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth had dropped out of it. The performance had met a situation it couldn't quite contain and was showing the edges. The cabin on the eastern boundary has been occupied informally for several years. With the storm damage, I wanted to ensure that any pack materials inside were removed before we left for the capital, Alaric said, still conversationally. And these materials you were concerned about, he nodded at the packet in Vera's hands. These would be the territorial claim documents, the 4-generation inheritance record that establishes Mara Vance's legal ownership of the cabin and surrounding land. A silence that was different from the previous ones, thicker. The room had gone very still, the kind of stillness that meant everyone had stopped pretending to do their morning tasks and was simply listening. Those documents, Roderick said carefully, are the subject of a pack dispute that predates. There is no dispute, Mara said. Her own voice surprised her. Not its steadiness, she had been working at that, but the volume of it, the way it carried across the hall without effort, the way it filled the space as though it had always had the right to. She heard the echo of it off the stone walls and felt something move through her chest, a physical resonance, as though the sound of her own voice in this room was doing something structural. Every face turned to her. She stood in the center of the Ironwood Lodge, the lodge she had been excluded from for 5 years, the lodge she had walked to as a supplicant and stood in as a ghost. And she met the eyes that were looking at her without looking away from any of them. My grandmother built that cabin before Roderick Hale was born, she said. She registered the claim, paid the territorial fees, kept the documentation current for 40 years. My mother inherited it legally. I inherited it from my mother. There is no dispute. There has never been a dispute. There has only been Roderick's decision that I was too powerless to object to his rewriting of that fact. She paused, and in the pause she felt the room breathing around her, felt the specific quality of 40 wolves listening to something they had been not hearing for years and were now, suddenly, hearing. He knew those documents existed. He sent 2 men with a torch to my cabin before dawn. That is not a pack dispute. That is the destruction of legal evidence. Roderick's jaw was very tight. You're making a serious accusation, he said. I'm stating facts, she said. The accusation is the facts. She looked at him directly. The way she had not been able to look at him for years, not because she was afraid of him, but because making direct eye contact with a higher-ranking pack member was a social declaration, a challenge, and she had been too isolated, too alone, to sustain the consequences of issuing one. She had always looked at his chin, his shoulder, the middle distance to his left. The strategic near miss of the eyes that said, I know my place. She looked him in the eyes. He held her gaze for a long, controlled moment, and she saw it. Saw in that moment the thing that 5 years of practiced avoidance had kept her from seeing clearly. The thing underneath the flat nothing expression, the thing that lived in the particular way his eyes narrowed just barely when she pushed back. The thing that all the controlled, deliberate management of her presence was actually about. He was afraid of her. Not of what she was, not of an Omega, not of a woman alone in a broken cabin. He was afraid of what she knew, had always been afraid of it. The exclusion, the dismissal, the slow erosion of her membership, none of it had been nothing. All of it had been a very careful, very sustained effort to keep her too diminished to be believed, because a person who was believed could tell the truth about what she had seen. We'll continue this discussion at the Capitol, Alaric said, stepping smoothly into the silence before Roderick could reconstruct his response. His voice had the quality of a pronouncement, Not loud, not forceful, but with the particular weight of a man who says things once and means them. Vera, you have the documents? Yes, sir. Good. He turned to the room, not performing, not making a speech, just addressing the hall the way a man who is used to being heard addresses a room. We'll be departing within the hour. I'm grateful for your hospitality. His gaze moved briefly to Roderick, and in that brief look was everything that had been said and not said since the moment he'd announced his name in this room. I look forward to our next conversation in a more formal setting, Alpha Hale. Roderick said nothing. The room exhaled. What? The hour before departure was the most complicated hour Mara had experienced in a long chain of complicated hours. Pack members she had not spoken to in years found reasons to cross her path. Some of them said nothing, just made eye contact, the real kind, the kind she had been receiving from the Royal Guard and which she was still not entirely accustomed to. Some of them said small things, brief things, the kind of things that weren't apologies but were in the neighborhood of apologies. I didn't know it was that bad. My daughter used your grandmother's remedy last winter. I should have said, I'm sorry for the porch. I shouldn't have laughed. She received each of them with the same even attention, saying very little, not performing forgiveness she hadn't decided she felt, but not performing coldness either. She was simply present, simply herself, and let them figure out what to do with that. The three other Omegas Vera had identified, Lena, a quiet woman in her 40s, Bryn, who was 20 and had come to the territory 3 years ago from a broken pack to the west, and Old Marsh, a male Omega who had been in the territory longer than Roderick and had developed an impressive gift for making himself functionally invisible. All found her before the hour was up. None of them asked anything directly, but they stood near her one by one and looked at her, and she looked back at them. And in that exchange, something passed that was understood by everyone involved without being spoken. You're not alone. Neither are you. Neither are we. She told Bryn specifically because Bryn was the youngest and had the fewest resources and the most exposed situation. If anyone asks you to testify about how the pack operates, tell the truth. All of it. You'll be protected. Bryn looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been promised protection before and has reason to be skeptical. By who? Mara glanced across the hall to where Vera was organizing the departure with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything. By people who have the authority to make it stick. Bryn was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, a small, careful nod, the kind that didn't commit too much and didn't reject either. It would have to be enough for now. They left the lodge in the thin morning light, 15 royal wolves and 1 Omega, moving east through the post-storm forest toward the royal shelter that was their first waypoint on the road to the capital. The cold was extraordinary, the brutal dry cold of a cleared winter sky that turned your breath to instant vapor and made your eyes ache in their sockets. But the sky was achingly blue, and the light off the snow was brilliant, and the air was so clean it felt like a physical thing, something solid you were moving through rather than simply breathing. They made good time for the first 2 hours. Dane, the young guard, the one she had kept from the edge in the worst of the night, was walking under his own power. He was pale and slower than the others, and she kept her eye on him automatically. The habit of the night before not yet released, but his stride was steady and his breathing was controlled. He had thanked her before they left, privately, in the formal way of someone who didn't have words large enough for what they wanted to express, and was defaulting to the structural language of duty and gratitude. She had told him to eat when they stopped and to say something if he felt dizzy. "Yes, ma'am," he had said, which had made her feel approximately 40 years older than she was. Alaric walked with her again. Not always. He ranged through the column periodically, checking on his people, talking with Vera about logistics and route, but he returned to her side at intervals that she had stopped noticing and started, without meaning to, waiting for. Their conversation was easy in the way of people who have already passed through the difficult work of initial knowing and arrived at something more comfortable on the other side. They talked about the forest. She showed him the marks of the storm on the trees, the specific ways the birches had shed ice versus the pines, what the broken top pattern on the spruce stands meant about wind direction. He listened with a focus that was real, not performed. He asked questions that indicated he was actually hearing the answers. At one point, she said something about her grandmother, a brief, specific thing, a memory of being taught to read storm skies. And he said, without making it momentous, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was the only person who taught me that what I had was enough," Mara said. A pause. The snow crunched under their feet. "She was right," he said. She didn't answer, but she felt the words take up residence somewhere inside her, the way very simple true things did when they arrived at the right moment. They were 2.5 hours out from the lodge, moving through a section of forest that opened into a long, narrow valley, the kind that channeled wind and collected snow depth, when the ground gave way. Not everywhere. Not suddenly. Just at the edge, where the slope of the valley wall met the flat of the valley floor, where the storm had packed new snow over a gap in the terrain that 3 feet of fresh powder had made invisible. Mara was 3 steps ahead of the main group when she felt the surface shift under her right foot. She had time to register it, 1 second, maybe less, the specific wrongness of ground that has no solid below it. And then the shelf collapsed. She went down. The slope was steep enough and the snow deep enough that she didn't fall so much as slide. The world tilting sideways with a sudden, stomach-dropping violence, and then she was moving fast, very fast, the snow around her not soft but consolidated into something close to ice by the temperature change, the valley wall rushing past in a white blur, and somewhere above her she heard voices. Alaric's voice, sharp and immediate. And then she hit the base of the valley wall with an impact that drove the air completely out of her lungs and set white sparks in her vision and left her lying very still in the blue shadow of the snowbank with no ability to move or breathe or assess what had just happened. Silence. Just the ringing in her ears and the distant sound of movement above. She tried to breathe, couldn't, for 3 terrible seconds. Then the spasm released and air came back, painful and cold and wonderful. She ran inventory. Arms. She'd had them wrapped around her head on impact. They moved. Legs. Both responding, no wrong angles. Ribs. There. 1, possibly 2, sending sharp protest with each breath. Head. Intact, she thought. The impact had been on her shoulder and back rather than her skull. She was lying in a hollow at the base of the valley wall, half buried in the snow from the slide, in a shadow that the afternoon sun, what was left of it, already dropping in the short winter sky, could not reach. The temperature in the shadow was significantly lower than the temperature in the open. She could feel the difference immediately, the cold reaching through her coat with a speed that told her clearly she could not stay here. She tried to stand, her left ankle folded. Not broken, she was almost certain the pain was wrong for broken, but badly wrenched in the fall, the joint refusing to bear weight with the violent insistence of a fresh sprain. She put her hand against the snowbank and tried again, made it upright, barely, standing on one leg with the other bearing no weight. Above her, the slope rose 12 feet, maybe 15. The collapsed section had taken a wide shelf of snow with it and left a raw face of ice and compacted snow that was nearly vertical. Her hands, pressed against it, found no purchase. "Mara," Alaric's voice from above. She looked up. His face at the edge, close enough that she could see the controlled focus in his expression, the total absence of panic, the immediate and practical assessment running behind his eyes. "Don't move. Are you injured?" "Ribs, maybe," she said. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "Ankle. Can't climb." He was already lying flat at the edge, extending his arm. She looked at the distance between his hand and her reach and did the math and knew immediately it wasn't enough. "There's a rope in Cutter's pack," Vera's voice from somewhere to Alaric's right. "Get it," Alaric said without looking away from her. "Mara, stay out of the shadow. Move left." She moved left. 1 step, 2, hopping on her right foot, biting down on what her ribs were telling her. The shadow line was 6 feet away. She moved toward it, leaving a trail of uneven prints in the snow. She was 4 feet from the shadow line when the sound started. Low. A long, deep resonance from somewhere above and to the right. Not thunder, not wind. The specific subsonic groan of a large mass of snow finding a new angle of repose. Secondary slide. She had 3 seconds, maybe 4. She had grown up in this forest and she had listened to her grandmother explain avalanche behavior, and she knew, with the absolute cellular certainty of someone whose knowledge was physical and not theoretical, that she had 3 seconds. She took them. 1 second, she pushed off her right foot as hard as it would bear, driving herself left toward the valley wall's protruding rock face, the one she'd seen from above and registered without consciously processing, the outcropping that stuck out far enough to create a pocket of protected space below it. 2 seconds. She hit the wall face first, got her arms up in time, pressed herself flat against the stone with her back to the valley. 3 seconds. The sound became everything. The secondary slide came down the valley wall in a white curtain, not the full collapse of a major avalanche, but enough, a thick, fast-moving wave of packed snow that swept through the space she'd been standing in and buried it to a depth of 4 feet in less than 2 seconds. It hit the rock overhang above her head and split around it, snow rushing past on both sides, close enough that she felt the cold displacement of air from it against her face. The roar of it was total, absolute, the kind of sound that exists in the body as much as the ears. And then it was over. Silence. The ringing kind. The kind that follows a sound too large for the world to immediately absorb. Mara pressed against the rock face with her eyes shut and took 3 careful breaths and did not move until she was certain the slope had stabilized. Then she opened her eyes. She was in a pocket of clear space, roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, the overhang above her and the valley wall behind her, the snow from the secondary slide packed solid on both sides and in front of her, leaving her enclosed in something that was not quite a cave but was not open air, a temporary hollow, already warming slightly from her body heat, the kind of space that could sustain a person for some hours if it stayed intact. If it stayed intact. She pressed her hand against the snow wall in front of her, hard, but not solid. The kind of snow that held under compression until it didn't, until the temperature shifted or a vibration hit it at the wrong frequency, or the weight above found a new line of settlement. She could not get out without help. Mara, Alaric's voice, above and to the left, slightly muffled now by the new snow. I heard the secondary. Talk to me. I'm here, she said, as clearly and firmly as she could manage. A pause. 1 second. 2. The pause of someone absorbing information and refusing to let their response to it be anything other than useful. Are you enclosed? Yes. Stable for now. Overhang above me. Injured status. Same as before. Ribs, ankle, nothing that changed. Good. His voice was very controlled, very level, and underneath the control was something she could hear, just at the edge of it, something that was not panic but was in the same family as panic, something personal and not strictly professional. We're coming for you. Do not shift your position. Do not push against the walls. I know, she said. I know you know, he said. And something in the way he said it, the echo of her own words from the cabin, the morning of the storm, landed in her chest with a precision that was almost painful. I'm telling you anyway. She pressed her back against the rock and held very still. Above her, on the valley's edge, she could hear them moving. The controlled, deliberate sounds of people who knew what they were doing, working a problem with systematic focus. Voices, brief and technical. The sound of equipment being organized. The creak of a rope being tested. She sat in her pocket of snow and rock and cold and breathed slowly and evenly and told herself all the things she knew to be true. The snow above her was stable. The overhang was solid. She had pressed her palm against it, and it was granite, the old kind, deep-rooted, not going anywhere. She had enough air. She had survived worse than this, or things equivalent to this, or things that had felt like this. She had opened her door into a blizzard for 15 dying wolves and kept them alive through the night with firewood calculations and her grandmother's knowledge and the stubborn refusal to consider failure as an option. She could hold still in a snow pocket for 40 minutes while trained professionals dug her out. She breathed. Above her, the sounds of work continued, steady, focused, purposeful, and the blue light filtering through the compressed snow walls of her hollow shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the afternoon tilted toward its end. She was cold. She was injured. She was enclosed in a temporary space with uncertain walls and a valley floor that had already demonstrated a willingness to collapse. And she was, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, completely calm. Not because nothing was wrong, everything was wrong, but because she was not alone in it. Because above her, a king was lying flat on a snow-covered ridge directing a rope operation with the focused attention of a man who had decided that her extraction was the only thing in the world that mattered right now. Because a woman who had almost died on her floor was coordinating the work with the same systematic precision she brought to everything. Because 15 wolves who had been dying at her door 18 hours ago were up there right now working to bring her back. She was not alone. The words settled into her in the deep cellular way that true things settle, the way her grandmother's teachings had settled, not as comfort exactly, but as solid ground, as something you could stand on. Mara, Alaric's voice again, closer now. We're 8 feet above you. The rope's going down on your right side. When it reaches you, tie it under your arms. Don't try to climb. We'll pull. Understood, she said, a sound to her right, the rope coming down through the snow, sliding through the gap between her hollow and the valley wall, the end of it dropping into view. She reached for it, got her hands around it. The hemp was cold and rough and absolutely real. She tied it the way her grandmother had taught her to tie things that needed to hold, with the particular care of someone who understood that a knot was a promise and that the quality of promises mattered. Ready, she said. The rope went taut. She felt it in her whole body, the pull, the absolute physical fact of another person on the other end holding on, and she pressed her back against the stone and let them bring her home. She came up out of the snow the way things come back from places they weren't supposed to return from, slowly, with effort, with the particular quality of something that has been tested past what seemed like its limit and has come through the other side still intact. The rope held. The knot held. And when her head cleared the snow surface and the full light of the winter afternoon hit her face, Alaric's hands found her arms and pulled her the rest of the way up, with a grip that had nothing restrained in it, the kind of grip that meant the controlled professionalism he'd been running on for the last 40 minutes had hit the edge of what it could contain. She came up onto solid ground, and he didn't let go immediately. She didn't ask him to. They stood there for a moment, just a moment, 3 or 4 seconds that didn't belong to the logistics of the situation or the next decision that needed to be made. With his hands around her arms and her feet on ground that stayed where she put them, and the winter sky enormous and blue above them both. She could feel the steadiness of him even through her coat, and she filed that sensation away in the place where she kept the things that mattered without her fully understanding yet why they mattered. Then Vera was there with a blanket, and Cutter was already assessing her ankle with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done field medicine before. And Dane, pale, exhausted Dane, was at her left with a flask of something hot that turned out to be a strong herbal infusion, and which she drank without protest because her hands were shaking, and her ribs were informing her that the adrenaline was wearing off, and reality was about to assert itself with considerable force. 2 ribs, Cutter said, sitting back from her ankle. Maybe 3. They'll hurt like hell, but they're not displaced. The ankle is a grade 2 sprain, bad but not structural damage. She can't walk on it without support. I can walk on, Mara said. You cannot, Ish, Cutter said, in exactly the tone of a man who has had this specific argument before and has already decided how it ends. The royal shelter is 2 hours from here, Vera said, kneeling to wrap the ankle with the systematic competence of someone following a protocol. We'll rig a carry. I'm not being carried, Mara said. A supported carry, Vera said, without looking up. 2 guards, 1 on each side, your weight distributed. You contribute what you can, they fill the gap. It's not the same as being carried. Mara looked at the sky for a moment, thought about arguing. Decided against it, because she had spent enough years in her own company to know the difference between pride that was worth defending and pride that was just going to get her killed in a frozen valley 2 hours from shelter. Fine, she said. Vera allowed herself a small, satisfied exhale and finished the wrapping. Alaric had moved slightly apart during the medical assessment, giving Cutter the space she understood, not withdrawing. He came back now and looked at her with the direct, serious attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things he was thinking carefully about. Are you actually fine, he said, or are you managing? She considered that distinction. It was a good one, the kind that required an honest answer rather than a reflexive one. Managing, she said, But I'm functional, and I'll be fine when we're inside. He nodded. The nod that meant I hear you, I trust the assessment, we move forward. Then we move, he said, and turned to the group. The 2 hours to the royal shelter were the longest 2 hours of Mara's recent memory, and that was saying something given the previous 48. Moving through knee-deep post-storm snow on one functional leg, supported between two guards, who were careful but couldn't entirely eliminate the jarring impact that reached her ribs with every uneven step. It was the kind of sustained physical effort that eventually stopped being painful and became simply a condition, a fact of the environment that you worked within rather than against. She put her mind on the horizon and her breath on account and let the guards do their work, contributing what she could and releasing what she couldn't, which was a skill that had taken her years to develop and which she was grateful for in this specific hour. Alaric stayed close throughout. Not hovering. She would have found hovering difficult to tolerate, the unwanted attention of someone managing her like a fragile thing, but present, available, at the near edge of her peripheral vision in a way that was grounding rather than suffocating. He talked to her when talking was useful, and was quiet when quiet was more useful, and the fact that he seemed to understand which was which, without requiring her to signal, it was something she noticed and tucked away without comment. They talked, during the quieter stretches, about the council, about the formal process, what testimony would look like, what evidence Vera had compiled, what the likely sequence of events was once they reached the capital. He explained it with clarity and without softening anything, which she appreciated. She had grown up being given information in diluted forms, information managed for her, pre-processed, stripped of its difficult edges on the assumption that she couldn't handle the full weight of it. Alaric gave her information the way she gave information, whole, accurate, trusting the recipient to deal with it. The council will convene within 3 days of our arrival, he said. Standard procedure when a king brings a formal complaint against a pack alpha. The alpha has the right to speak in his own defense, and his council members can speak on his behalf. You'll have the same opportunity, you and any witnesses you choose to bring. The 3 Omegas, Mara said immediately. Lena, Bryn, and Marsh. Vera's already noted them. We'll send formal summons. He paused. They'll be protected for the duration of the proceedings. I want you to know that. I told Bryn the same thing, Mara said. That protection was real. It is. She'll need to hear it from someone with more institutional weight than me. She'll hear it, he said simply. She believed him. That was still a strange sensation, believing a powerful person without evidence, without the cautious reservation she maintained around every person who held rank above her. She had not trusted anyone with power over her situation since her grandmother died. She understood, examining it, that this was reasonable. She had not been given reason to trust. But standing here, in the cold, with Alaric Nightfall's word offered to her as plainly and without ceremony as her grandmother's had been, she found that she believed it. The royal shelter appeared through the trees just as the light began to fail. A substantial building, stone and timber, clearly constructed for the specific purpose of housing a traveling royal party. Well insulated, well stocked, maintained by a staff of 2 caretakers who had survived the storm in a back annex and came out to meet them with the barely contained relief of people who had been isolated for 2 days and were delighted to have something useful to do. Mara was inside before she had fully processed the transition from cold to warm, installed in a chair near the largest fire she'd been close to in days, with her ankle elevated and her ribs bound properly, and a meal in front of her that was the first substantial food she'd eaten in almost 36 hours. The food tasted extraordinary. She was aware this was largely the accumulated deficit of the last 2 days expressing itself, but she didn't care. She ate steadily and let the warmth work into her and felt the particular bone-deep relief of a body that has been performing at its maximum for an extended period, finally being permitted to step down. Vera sat across from her while she ate. Not watching her, Vera was reviewing documents, the oilskin packet open on the table, the inheritance papers spread out and examined with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She had been through them twice already, Mara thought, but she was going through them again, the way a thorough person goes through important things twice and then goes through them a third time just to be certain. These are impeccable, Vera said, without looking up. Your grandmother's documentation is better than most formal territorial records I've seen. Every transfer is witnessed, every fee payment recorded with dates and confirmation marks. There are 43 years of continuous record here. She was a healer, Mara said. She understood that precision in record-keeping was the difference between a person being believed and not being believed when it mattered. She applied the same standard to her own documents. Vera looked up. Something in her expression, the perpetual focused assessment of it, had softened by a degree. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you, Mara said. She respected competence, especially in women, because she said women who were competent usually had to work twice as hard to demonstrate it. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then, she wasn't wrong. They sat in the firelight with the documents between them, and outside the shelter the last of the winter light died, and the temperature outside dropped to the killing cold of a clear winter night, and inside the fire burned steadily in a well-maintained hearth, and Mara ate and breathed and held the warmth around herself like something earned. They reached the capital on the second day. The road from the royal shelter had been cleared by the time they hit the main territorial highway, proper road crews out with their plows and their sand, the kind of organized infrastructure response that came from a centralized government that took winter seriously. And the last 4 hours of travel were almost comfortable by comparison to what had come before. Mara's ribs had settled into the dull, manageable throb that signaled the acute stage was passing. Her ankle, in a proper support brace borrowed from the shelter's medical stores, bore weight with discomfort she could work within. She had been to the capital exactly once before, at 16, with her grandmother, for a healers' conference that happened once every 3 years at the seat of the High Council. She remembered it as large and loud and overwhelming, the sheer density of population and sound and activity after a childhood in the northern forest producing a kind of pleasant sensory overload that she'd spent the whole visit both overwhelmed by and reluctant to leave. It was larger than she remembered. Vael, the capital city of the northern kingdoms, built at the confluence of 2 major rivers on a granite plateau that gave it natural elevation above the surrounding plains, spread across the hill in layers of stone and timber and glass that caught the winter light and threw it back from 100 angles. The royal fortress sat at the crest, its walls dark gray against the bright sky, its towers flying the nightfall colors, black and deep amber, the same amber as Alaric's eyes, she noticed without quite meaning to. They entered through the main gate, and the gate guard's response to Alaric's arrival told her more than any briefing could have about his standing here. Not the performed ceremony of people executing a protocol, but the genuine, specific relief of people who had been concerned and were no longer concerned. The gate captain, a weathered woman with a soldier's bearing, had looked at Alaric with the expression of someone who had held a concern for days and was now releasing it. "We had word the storm rerouted you, Majesty," she said. "We've been—" A pause, the gate captain's professional composure modulating something that was not purely professional, monitoring the situation. "We found good shelter," Alaric said and glanced briefly at Mara as he said it. Not performance, not demonstration, just a natural movement of his attention to the person the statement was actually about. The gate captain's gaze moved to Mara, assessed her, the borrowed clothes, the supported ankle, the set of a woman who had been through something significant and was still standing, made no comment. But the assessment had happened, and Mara filed it away. Inside the fortress, the machinery of a royal return activated immediately. Staff, advisors, the quiet orchestration of people who kept an institution running and had been doing it long enough to respond to changed circumstances with a flexibility that looked effortless. Alaric was absorbed into it within minutes, surrounded by people with questions and documents and the accumulated decisions of a ruler who had been absent for longer than expected. He stopped at the point where the corridor split, turned to look at her over the heads of the 2 advisors, who had immediately flanked him, and said, clearly enough to carry, "Vera will get you settled. You'll have everything you need. I'll see you before the council convenes." "All right," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, just a moment, that same quality she had noticed in her cabin when she first really looked at him, the thing that was neither performance nor concealment, but simply the direct attention of a person who looked at what was in front of them and saw it. And then the corridor's current took him, and he was gone. Vera appeared at her elbow. "This way." The room she was given was in the eastern wing, modest by fortress standards, but immense by hers. A real bed, a proper one, with a frame and a mattress, and 2 wool blankets and a pillow that didn't smell like rabbit fur. A wash basin with a pitcher that was brought to her filled with warm water. A window that looked out over the city's lower districts, the rooftops running in irregular lines down the hill to the river, smoke rising from 100 chimneys in the still, cold air. She stood at the window for a while before she did anything else. Just stood and looked at the city and thought about where she had been 3 days ago, sitting on a sleeping mat in a cracking cabin, stitching her coat, waiting out a storm she was not prepared for. 3 days. It didn't seem possible that 3 days was the distance between that person and this moment. She washed, changed into the clothes Vera had provided, practical, warm, well-made, fitting her well enough that someone had approximated her size with reasonable accuracy. She rebandaged her ribs the way Cutter had shown her, a careful routine that she was already competent at, her body understanding the mechanics of it after 2 days of practice. She sat on the edge of the bed and touched the mattress with both hands, and felt the surreal, disorienting reality of a soft surface under her palms. She did not cry. She had not cried through any of it, through the storm or the night of keeping 15 wolves alive, or the confrontation in the lodge, or the valley slope, or the rope and the snow, and coming up into Alaric's hands. She didn't cry now either. She didn't cry. What she felt was not grief and was not relief and was not joy. It was something slower and more fundamental than any of those, something that moved at the pace of deep water. The feeling of a person who has been pointed in one direction by every force around them for a very long time, and has now, for the first time, felt those forces change. She slept for 10 hours without dreaming. Vera came for her on the morning of the second day in the capital. The High Council convened in the formal hall at the fortress's center, a room designed to make its purpose unmistakable. High ceilings, stone walls, a long table of dark wood, the 7 council seats arranged with the specific geometry of authority, 3 on each side and 1 at the head seat belonging to the presiding member who, today, was a tall woman named Counselor Adara Shen, whose silver hair and the quality of her stillness marked her as someone who had occupied rooms like this one for a very long time. The council had assembled by the time Mara entered with Vera. 6 of the 7 seats were filled. The 7th, the head seat, was Alaric's, and he was already there, already present, and he looked at her when she came in with the same directness she was accustomed to from him, a steady acknowledgement that she had arrived and was seen. Roderick Hale was already in the room. He was seated at the witness bench on the left side of the chamber, his posture perfectly controlled, his expression arranged in the specific set of a man who has decided that his best position is one of calm, cooperative dignity. He was wearing formal packwear, the ironwood colors, dark green and gray, and he had the groomed, composed appearance of someone who had used the journey time to prepare both himself and his arguments. 2 pack council members flanked him, older men, both of them, with the practiced neutrality of people who understood that their job today was to provide the optics of institutional support. He did not look at her when she entered. She sat at the witness bench on the right side of the chamber, where Vera had positioned her, and she looked at the council, and she looked at the room, and she looked finally at Roderick, who was still not looking at her. He would have to look at her eventually. That was the nature of the proceeding. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. The formal opening took 20 minutes. The reading of the proceeding's purpose, the invocation of the relevant laws, the establishment of the record. Mara listened carefully to all of it, noting the specific language, the legal framework being invoked. Vera had briefed her the night before, had walked her through the process with the thorough patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge was the specific kind of protection that couldn't be taken away once given, and she recognized the structure unfolding in front of her, which made it less overwhelming than it might otherwise have been. When it was her turn to speak, she stood. The room was very quiet. She told the truth. Not with emotion, not performing emotion, not suppressing it either, just letting the facts carry their own weight, which they did. She told it chronologically, clearly, in the plain, precise language that her grandmother had taught her to use when precision mattered more than rhetoric. She told it from the beginning, not from 3 days ago, but from the beginning, from the afternoon she was 17, and Roderick had pointed at her in the great hall, and the pack had laughed, and that was the first day she had understood what her life in Ironwood territory was going to be. She told it all, the preparation for the storm, and the conversation on the porch, and the door blown inward into the night. The 15 wolves dragged in one by one, the firewood and the broth and the night, the documents and the 2 men with a torch, the slope and the snow and the rope. She told it, and she did not look away from the council, and she did not embellish, and she did not ask them to be moved by it. She simply set the facts in front of them like her grandmother had taught her to set things, with care and precision in the right order, and then trust the arrangement to do its own work. When she was finished, Counselor Shen asked questions, clear, specific questions, dates, locations, names, sequences. Mara answered every one. When she didn't know something precisely, she said so. When she was certain, she was certain. Then it was Roderick's turn. He spoke with the polished confidence of a man who had held a public position for 11 years and understood the performance requirements of formal proceedings. He acknowledged that Mara lived outside the main pack community. He framed it as her preference, her choice to maintain her grandmother's cabin, her personal disposition toward solitude. He acknowledged the storm and the resource conversation on the porch and recast it as a routine interaction that had been misinterpreted. He did not directly deny the torch and the cedar chest. He referred to it as a misunderstanding involving overzealous pack members acting without his full authorization. He was very good at it. Mara watched him and felt a distant admiration for the mechanics, the way a skilled performer could reconstruct a landscape of facts without technically falsifying any individual fact, just rearranging the distances between them until the whole picture looked different. But Vera had the documents. Vera presented them to the council with the same clean efficiency with which she did everything else. The inheritance papers, immaculate and complete. The resource distribution records she had pulled from the lodge's own administration files during their stay. A compiled account of her assessment of the 3 other Omegas' situations gathered in the hours before departure. She presented each piece in order with a brief explanation and then sat down. The council reviewed the documents in a silence that had texture to it. The specific, concentrated quality of people encountering information that was resolving a picture they had previously only had partial visibility of. Counselor Shen looked at the resource distribution records for a long time. Alpha Hail, she said, without looking up. In the 5 years of records represented here, the per capita resource allocation for wolves, ranked Omega in your territory, is approximately 40% of the allocation for equivalent population groups in other ranks. Can you explain this discrepancy? Roderick's voice was controlled. Omega-ranked wolves typically have different needs. 40%, Counselor Shen repeated. Not loudly, just again. The repetition of a number that did not require commentary. A silence. Furthermore, said the council member to her right, a broad-shouldered older man named DeVere, whose voice had the resonance of a man who had been in formal proceedings long enough to know exactly when to deploy weight. The records show that the cabin designated in the inheritance documents as belonging to the Vance family line has been listed in pack property inventories for the past 4 years as pack-owned territory pending resolution of an informal dispute. He looked at Roderick. There was no formal dispute filing. No council review, no legal challenge, just a line in an inventory. Roderick said nothing. That constitutes fraudulent property reclassification under Northern Territorial law, DeVere said. The room was very still. Mara sat on her bench with her hands folded and her back straight and felt the stillness move through her like a wave. Not triumph, not vindication, not any of the things she had imagined during the long years of not imagining that this moment would feel like. What she felt was simpler than any of those. It was the feeling of watching something that had been wrong for a long time, that everyone around it had chosen not to look at directly, finally being seen. Just that. The particular quiet of being seen. Counselor Shen laid the documents down on the table in front of her with a deliberateness that was itself a statement and looked across the chamber at Alaric. Your Majesty, you were present for the events described in Miss Vance's account. Do you affirm the accuracy of her testimony? I affirm every word of it, Alaric said, simply, without elaboration because the testimony had not required it. And you are formally requesting council action on the evidence presented? I am. Counselor Shen looked at her colleagues. A brief, efficient exchange of glances that contained a conversation Mara couldn't fully read, but whose general direction was clear. We'll recess for deliberation, Counselor Shen said. 1 hour. What? The hour passed in an anteroom adjacent to the council chamber. A smaller, warmer space with a fireplace and a tray of food that Vera had arranged for her. Practical as always, because practical people understood that a body that had been under sustained stress for 4 days needed fuel regardless of whether the mind was focused on the food. Mara ate. She sat by the fire and ate and looked at the flames and didn't try to predict what was happening behind the council chamber's closed door. Alaric came to the anteroom 20 minutes into the recess. He had been managing the proceedings with his counsel, the specific demands of a king who was also a participant in a case, which required a careful navigation of roles. And he looked, for the first time since she had met him, genuinely tired in a way that went past the physical. The kind of tired that came from carrying something that had required careful handling for too long and had finally been set down. He sat across from her without ceremony and accepted the cup of tea she poured for him because it was something practical to do. "How are you doing?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me when it's over." "Fair enough." A pause. He turned the cup in his hands, a small, habitual movement, the kind of gesture that meant a person was moving through something internally that wasn't quite ready to be words yet. "You spoke very well." "I spoke accurately," she said. "The accuracy is what matters." "Yes," he agreed. "But the accuracy required courage. Those are different things." She looked at the fire. "My grandmother used to say that honesty was cheap in easy circumstances. The price of it only shows up when telling the truth costs you something." "What did it cost you today?" She thought about it. "Nothing," she said slowly, which surprised me. I think I expected it to cost more. The confrontation, the formal record, being in the same room as him while I said it. She paused. It didn't feel the way I expected it to feel. How did it feel? Like setting something down, she said. Something I'd been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that directness that she had stopped trying to interpret and had started simply accepting as the way he inhabited proximity to people and things he was thinking carefully about. "Mara," he said, after the council, I want to ask you something, not as a formal matter, not in any official capacity, just a pause that was unusual for him, a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation that she had not heard from him before. As myself, asking you. She waited. "I want to ask if you'd be willing to stay," he said, "in the capital, with the royal pack." She looked at him. "Not as a guest," he added, "not as a temporary arrangement while things settle. I want to offer you a formal place in the royal household, a position, a title, a real structure with real protections. Based on what you know, what you can do, and..." Another pause, smaller. "Because I would like you to be here." The fire crackled. Somewhere in the building, a door closed, the sound of it carrying through stone walls. She held his gaze and thought about her cabin, about the 4 clay bowls and the rabbit fur seal on the door and the crack in the south wall and the 47 pieces of birch stacked against the east wall that had been the whole margin between her and the cold. About 5 years of being counted as nothing by people who had known her name and chosen to forget it. About a rope going taut in a snow-buried valley. About being pulled up. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "I know," she said, "but I will." She looked at the fire for a moment and then back at him, and she said it with the same quality she'd said yes on the porch 2 nights ago, from the place that didn't require deliberation, that had already been there, waiting for the moment to be spoken. "Yes." He looked at her, and in his face was the thing she had seen in him before, that she was learning to read, the thing that was not the performance of authority or the mask of a king managing a situation, but the simpler, plainer reality of a person who had wanted something and had been prepared to not receive it and had received it anyway. Something in him settled. She saw it happen. "Good," he said, quietly, as though the word was the entire sentence and the sentence was all that needed to be said. The council reconvened at the exact hour. Counselor Shen stood, which was not the usual posture for delivering a council finding, and which told Mara something about the weight of what was coming before the words began. The High Council has reviewed the evidence presented in this proceeding, she said, and has reached a unanimous determination. She looked at Roderick Hale directly. Alpha Roderick Hale, on the charge of systematic neglect and discriminatory resource denial toward Omega-ranked pack members in your territory, this council finds the evidence conclusive. On the charge of fraudulent property reclassification affecting the inheritance rights of Mara Vance, this council finds the evidence conclusive. On the charge of obstruction of justice through the attempted destruction of formal legal documents during a royal investigation, this council finds the evidence conclusive. She paused. The room had gone completely still. The stillness of a moment that everyone in it knew was significant, that would be spoken of afterward as a before and after point in time. By the authority of the Crown Council of the Northern Territories, Alpha Roderick Hale is hereby stripped of his title, rank, and authority over Ironwood Territory, effective immediately. His leadership seal is revoked. Ironwood Territory will be placed under council administration pending the appointment of new leadership, which will be conducted in accordance with proper democratic pact procedure. Another pause. Additionally, the cabin and surrounding land registered under the Vance family inheritance documents are formally confirmed as the sole legal property of Mara Vance, with full territorial protections applied. All pact claims to that property, formal or informal, are null and void from this moment. Roderick Hale said nothing. He sat on his bench, straight-backed, controlled, the performance still in place even now, and said nothing. He looked, for the first time, not like a man managing a situation, but like a man inside a situation he could no longer manage. The specific, frozen quality of a person who has constructed their world with great care around a particular foundation and has just watched that foundation be named for what it actually was. He looked briefly at Mara. She held his gaze. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She did not feel triumph, or not only that. She felt something more complicated and more human than triumph. She felt the particular sadness of watching a person reveal, at their lowest moment, that they had always been afraid. That all of it, the 5 years, the slow exclusion, the porch, and the firewood, and the torch, had been fear. A man afraid of a small woman in a broken cabin, and choosing cruelty because cruelty was the only way he knew to manage what frightened him. She didn't forgive it. She didn't need to forgive it, but she understood it, in the way you understand a thing when the understanding doesn't require you to excuse it. He looked away first. Counselor Shen's voice continued. Miss Vance, on behalf of the High Council of the Northern Territories, and here, for the first time, the formal neutrality of her voice shifted, just slightly, toward something that was not neutral at all, toward something that was human and specific and real. This council formally acknowledges your actions during the storm of the 23rd. You sheltered members of the royal household at personal cost and with no obligation to do so. You preserved the lives of the king and his guard. You demonstrated, in the most direct terms possible, the quality that distinguishes a genuine pack member from a formal one. A pause. You are not a burden. You are not insignificant. You are the wolf who saved the king. And this council is grateful. The room was very still. Mara sat in the stillness and felt the words arrive inside her, felt them settle, all the way down, past the managed surface and the practiced neutrality and the 5 years of careful compression, down to the place where the 17-year-old girl who had been pointed at in the Great Hall still lived, still sat with her hands in her lap, and waited to be told what she was worth. She told her, this is what you are worth. Hear it, let it in. The girl listened. Mara did not cry, but she sat very still in the high-ceilinged chamber, in the winter light coming through the tall windows, and she breathed slowly, and she let herself feel the specific weight of being seen, truly seen, in a formal, public, permanent way, by people who had the power to make the scene matter, who had looked at what she had done and called it by its real name. Vera beside her said nothing, but her hand moved briefly to rest on Mara's forearm, just a touch, just a moment, and then withdrew. It was enough. It was more than enough. Afterward, in the corridor outside the council chamber, as the formal proceedings dissolved into the quieter logistics of aftermath, documents being signed, arrangements being made, Roderick Hale being escorted from the building by council guards with a silence from him that was somehow more dignified than anything he might have said, Dane found her. The young guard. The youngest of the 15, the one whose pulse she had monitored through the worst of the night, the one who had called her ma'am and made her feel 40 years old. He was in full guard uniform today, the nightfall colors sharp and formal, and he looked considerably more recovered than he had 3 days ago, the pallor replaced by something approaching his normal color, the tremor in his hands gone. He stopped in front of her and stood very straight, and his expression had the earnest seriousness of someone who has been thinking about what they want to say for some time. "Miss Vance," he said. "Dane," she said. "I wanted to—" He started and then stopped because whatever he had rehearsed apparently wasn't quite right in the moment, and he was too honest to deliver something that felt wrong. He started again. "You kept me alive. I know everyone says that to you, but I want you to know I understand what it cost. The firewood and the food, and you were alone. And we showed up dying at your door, and you just—" Another stop. "I wanted to say thank you in a way that meant something." She looked at him, at the young, earnest face, the complete absence of artifice in it. "You already thanked me," she said. "I know. I wanted to do it again. Because the first time I was still shaking, and I don't think I did it right." She was quiet for a moment. "You did it right," she said. "You're doing it right now." A pause. "Take care of yourself out there. Eat when you're cold. Don't let anyone tell you that rest is weakness." He smiled, a real smile, unguarded, the kind that made him look his age. "Yes, ma'am." She shook her head, but she was almost smiling. He nodded once, formally, with the specific precision of a guard performing an honor rather than a protocol, and then turned and went back to his post. She watched him go. Behind her, the Capitol went on being the Capitol, large and loud and full of the business of a world that had continued moving during the 4 days she had been inside the storm. The fortress corridor was busy with people whose lives intersected with this place in 100 different ways, and she was standing in the middle of it with an ankle that hurt and ribs that hurt and a formal letter in her pocket from Counselor Shen confirming the return of her property. She was standing in the middle of it, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not invisible. Alaric appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving toward her with the unhurried, purposeful stride she had learned. He looked for the first time since she had met him, since he had opened his eyes in her cabin and said, "Who are you?" with the remnants of frost still in his voice. Entirely at ease. Not relaxed. She did not think Alaric Nightfall had a mode that was purely relaxed. He was too fundamentally oriented toward the work of the world for that. But at ease, in the specific way of a person who has done what they needed to do, and the doing of it has been sufficient. He stopped in front of her. "Council signed off on the administrative arrangements," he said. "Ironwood Territory will have an interim administrator in place within the week. The 3 Omegas you identified will be contacted by formal messenger tomorrow." "Bryn will be scared," Mara said. "Vera's writing her letter personally," he said. "She'll know what to say." Mara nodded. He looked at her for a moment. "How are you doing? And this time I actually want to know." She thought about it, did the same honest inventory she had done the night before, but with different contents. The ache in her ribs, the support of the floor under her feet, the letter in her pocket, Dane's earnest face, the council chamber, the words the wolf who saved the king sitting inside her like a warm stone. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm doing better than I've done in a long time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good," he said. The same word he'd said in the anteroom, the same quality in it, simple, true, enough. They stood in the corridor of the northern capital's fortress, the afternoon light coming in at a low winter angle through the high windows, and around them the world moved and the day continued, and somewhere in the north, snow was still falling on a territory that would have to learn, slowly, to be something different than it had been. And Mara Vance stood in it, in all of it, in the light and the movement and the complicated, promising difficulty of what came next, and did not look for a wall to put her back against. She stood in the middle and let the world be large around her, and held her ground. What came next was not simple. She had known it wouldn't be. She had grown up watching her grandmother work, watching how the things that mattered most required the most sustained effort, how the distance between a decision and its full realization was almost always longer and more difficult than the moment of the decision itself. The night in the cabin had been the decision. The council had been the formal acknowledgement of it, but the real work, the rebuilding, the reshaping, the slow and sometimes painful process of becoming something different in a world that had a long memory, that was what came next. That was the part that didn't fit into a single night or a single room. She moved into the eastern wing of the fortress not as a guest or a temporary arrangement, but as a permanent resident of the royal household, and she spent the first weeks in the capital learning what that meant in practice. It meant a great deal of work she had not anticipated. The royal household was not a passive institution. It was a living thing, an organization of several hundred people, from the council members and senior advisors at its top to the caretakers and kitchen staff at its foundation, all of them connected by the specific web of obligation and function and informal power that made a large institution actually run. She had stepped into that web at an unusual angle, not as a diplomat or a military officer or a council member, but as something that the household's existing categories didn't quite have a name for. The woman who had saved the king, the Omega who had testified before the council, Alarix, and here the household's language became imprecise in a way that everyone noticed and nobody addressed directly, because imprecision was sometimes the kindest available option while reality was still being negotiated. Vera gave her work. Mara had not asked for it, had not expected it, had been prepared to spend however long was necessary in the patient, invisible waiting mode she had developed over 5 years of making herself small in other people's spaces. But Vera had appeared in her room on the 4th morning with a folder of documents and a cup of tea and the expression of a woman who had assessed a resource and decided to use it. The capital's Omega community, Vera said, sitting without preamble. There are approximately 230 Omega-ranked wolves in Vile and its immediate surrounding territories. The council maintains a support structure for them, resource allocation, housing protections, access to medical care, but the structure is largely administrative. It exists on paper better than it operates in practice. I know the gap between paper and practice, Mara said. I know you do, Vera said, which is why I want you to assess it. Mara looked at the folder. It contained, she discovered, years of administrative records, allocation reports, housing surveys, petitions that had been filed and received and responded to with the particular bureaucratic courtesy that meant received, acknowledged, shelved. The kind of documentation that told you exactly how a system worked when nobody was watching it work. She spent a week reading it. Then she spent a week in the city, walking. Her ankle had healed to the point where she moved without support. Though cold mornings still reminded her of the valley slope with a specificity she had decided to treat as useful information rather than inconvenience. Through the lower districts, the places where the 230 Omegas actually lived, actually navigated their days, actually encountered the structures that existed for them on paper. She brought a notebook. She asked questions, not the questions of someone conducting a formal survey, not the clinical remove of an administrator gathering data, but the questions of someone who had lived the thing she was asking about, who could sit in a small, cold room with a woman who was afraid to complain because complaining had always cost her more than it fixed, and say, I know, tell me anyway. They told her. Every story was different in its particulars. A male Omega who had been denied pack membership in 3 territories and had come to the capital as a last option, only to find the formal support structure required documentation he didn't have. A family of 4, an Omega woman, her 2 daughters, her elderly mother, living in a building whose heating system had been flagged for repair 18 months ago and not repaired because the complaint had been filed at the wrong administrative level and had been cycling between departments since. A young woman, barely 17, who had come from a rural territory alone and was surviving on the margins of the capital's economy with no formal pack connection and no legal protections that applied to her specific situation. Mara came back from each of these visits and wrote what she had found with the same precision her grandmother had applied to 40 years of medicinal records. Clear, specific, factual. The problem, the existing structure's failure point, what would actually help, what would actually not help, despite sounding like it would. At the end of the 2nd week, she brought the notebook to Vera. Vera read it in one sitting. When she looked up, Her expression had the quality Mara had come to associate with her arriving at a conclusion that she had already half-formed but needed confirmation of. "You're going to need to present this to the council," Vera said. "I know," Mara said. "They'll push back on some of it. The funding recommendations especially. There are council members who will frame it as a resource issue when it's actually a priority issue." "I know that too," Mara said. "The administrative delay on the heating repair isn't a funding problem. The funding was allocated, it's sitting in the maintenance account. The problem is the complaint routing system, which sends Omega-filed complaints through a secondary review process that doesn't exist for complaints filed by higher-ranked PAC members. It adds 6 to 8 months to the response timeline for no functional reason except that it was designed by people who thought an Omega's complaint was inherently less urgent," Vera finished. "Yes." Vera closed the notebook. "I'll set the meeting." The council meeting was the second time Mara stood before the High Council, and it was entirely different from the first. The first time she had been a witness, standing in a formal proceeding, giving account of things that had been done to her, setting the record straight. She had been passive in the sense that mattered. She had been responding to a situation that had been created by other people's choices. Her job had been to tell the truth and trust the structure to act on it. This time she was not responding, she was proposing. She stood at the council table with her notebook and a hand-drawn diagram of the complaint routing system and the direct, level voice that she had learned from her grandmother and refined over 22 years of being a person who had to make every word count because she was never given many of them, and she told the council what she had found and what she believed needed to change and why. She was thorough, she was specific. She anticipated the objections she had predicted to Vera and addressed them before they were raised, which she could see annoyed 3 of the 7 council members in the particular way that people who are accustomed to deflecting difficult things with procedural questions are annoyed when their questions are answered in advance. Councillor De Vere, the broad-shouldered older man who had cited the fraudulent property reclassification at Roderick's hearing, asked the sharpest questions. He was not hostile, he was rigorous, which was better, because rigorous could be satisfied with good answers, and hostile was just looking for an angle. She had good answers. When she was done, Councillor Shen looked at the diagram for a long moment. "You've been in the capital for 16 days, she said. "Yes," Mara said. "You identified systemic failures in the Omega support structure that have been in place for approximately," Shen consulted the document in front of her, "7 years, in some cases longer. The complaint routing bifurcation was implemented 9 years ago as a temporary measure during a staff shortage," Mara said. "There's a notation in the administrative record that it was intended to be reviewed and reversed after 6 months. The review never happened." "Why not?" De Vere asked. "Because the people most affected by it didn't have the institutional access to flag it to the people with the authority to change it." She paused. "That's the central failure. Not malice, though in some cases malice is also present, but the way a system can perpetuate harm through inertia when the people experiencing the harm aren't in the rooms where the decisions are made." A silence. Councillor Shen set her pen down. "Miss Vance, I'd like to propose that this council formally commission a review of the Omega support structure based on your findings. And I'd like to propose that you lead that review." Mara looked at her. "You're asking me to lead a formal council commission," she said. "I'm asking if you're willing to," Shen said. Deliberately, the same distinction Alaric had made on the porch, in the starlight. Willing. Not able, not required. The specific respect of a question that was actually a question. "Yes," Mara said. For the 3rd time in as many weeks, from the same place, the place that had already decided, that was simply waiting for the moment to say it. "Yes, I will." Spring came. The way spring came in the Northern Territories, slowly, grudgingly, in increments so small that the change seemed impossible, until one morning you walked outside and noticed that the air had a quality it hadn't had the day before, a faint, almost theoretical softness that meant the season had, finally, shifted the balance. Mara noticed it on a morning in late March, standing on the fortress wall with a cup in her hands, watching the city below emerge from the particular gray exhaustion of late winter into the tentative, uncertain hope of early spring. The river was running fast with snowmelt. Smoke still rose from the chimneys. It would be weeks yet before anyone stopped needing fires. But the smoke had a different quality, lighter, less urgent. She had been in the capital for 3 months. In 3 months, she had led the formal commission review, produced a 60-page report that the council had formally adopted with 6 recommendations and 4 direct policy changes. The complaint routing bifurcation had been dissolved, reversed to a single track. Omega filed complaints treated with the same urgency as any other, with a mandatory response timeline that had actual enforcement mechanisms attached to it. The heating repair had been completed in the first week of February. The young woman from the rural territory had been formally registered under the capital's Omega Protection Charter and had a place in a shared household with 3 others in a similar situation, under a new program that Mara had specifically designed after sitting in her small room and listening to her tell her story. The work was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time, possibly ever, in the sense of something that reached a complete and final resolution. Systems that had been built over decades in directions that served some people better than others did not reverse themselves in 3 months, no matter how good the report or how firm the council's adoption. She knew that. She had her grandmother's pragmatic relationship with the long view, the understanding that the important work was often invisible, that it happened in small increments and sustained efforts, and that the person doing it usually died before they saw the full picture of what they had built. She was willing to be that person. She was finding, made for that work in a way that felt less like a choice than a recognition, the same recognition she had arrived at with every significant decision of the past 3 months. This is what I am. This is what I do. I do more with less. I pay attention to the things that are too small for people with more to bother with. Her grandmother had told her that being small didn't mean being weak. She was beginning to understand the full weight of what that meant, not just in the physical sense, in the management of cold and hunger and isolation, but in this sense too, in the understanding that proximity to difficulty, to marginalization, to the ways systems failed the people at their edges, that understanding was not a disadvantage. It was a specific and irreplaceable form of knowledge, and knowledge, properly used, was the thing that changed the shape of the world. "You're up early," Alaric's voice, behind her. She didn't turn immediately, just acknowledged his presence in the way she had grown accustomed to over 3 months of daily proximity, the small recalibration of her awareness that his presence produced without effort. "I sleep early," she said. "It's a cabin habit. You're up with the sun, or you lose half the useful light." He came to stand beside her. He had not bothered with formal wear, just a heavy dark coat over his clothes, his hair not fully arranged, the quality of a man who had come out because there was someone he wanted to stand beside rather than because he had somewhere to be. She had learned to read these small signals from him over the weeks, the vocabulary of someone who operated in a world of formal demands and formal presentations, and used the informal moments deliberately as things that were chosen rather than defaulted. "The council approved the Northern Territory extension of the charter yesterday," he said, "while you were in the lower districts." She turned to look at him. "The full extension?" "All 6 rural territories. The charter language was adopted as written." She was quiet for a moment. The full extension meant that the protection provisions she had drafted weren't limited to the capital and its immediate surroundings. They applied across the Northern Territory network, which meant the Lenas and Brins and Marshes of every isolated pack had a formal, enforceable recourse that hadn't existed a month ago. "Bryn sent a letter," she said. "I know, Vera mentioned it." She said she went to the pack council meeting last week. First time in 2 years she'd entered that room. A pause. She said she sat in the middle of the bench, not at the end. Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. She looked at the river below, the snow melt rushing through it, fast and cold and going somewhere. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. "Something I've been not avoiding exactly, finding the right moment for. Tell me." She turned to face him fully. 3 months of daily proximity had changed the nature of her relationship with his particular kind of attention. She no longer felt the need to look away from it, no longer felt the slight vertigo of being looked at by someone who actually saw what they were looking at. She met his eyes and held them the way she held the eyes of anyone she was speaking honestly with. "When you asked me to stay," she said, "in the anteroom after the council, I said yes quickly. Maybe too quickly for you to know whether I understood what I was saying yes to. I trusted that you did. he said. I want to make sure you know why, she said. It wasn't gratitude. Or not only that, and it wasn't. She stopped, organizing the words with the precision she applied to the things that mattered most. I've spent 5 years being nothing to a pack that should have been my home. And I know what it cost me, and I know I survived it. And I'm not looking for someone to fix what it cost. I fixed most of that myself. A pause. But I've been around you long enough now to understand what it feels like when something is true rather than convenient. When a decision comes from the place that knows rather than the place that calculates. And when you asked me, another pause, shorter, I knew. I knew the way I knew to open the door into the blizzard, not because it was safe, because it was true. He was very still. I'm not, she said, and almost laughed at the difficulty of it, the way the words were both entirely clear and entirely insufficient. I'm not saying this as a formal declaration of anything. I'm saying it because you're a person who deserves to know the truth of the things that concern you, and this concerns you. Yes, he said. Yes, what? Yes to everything you just said. He turned toward her fully, the same movement she had made, the complete orientation of a person who has decided that this moment is worth the full weight of their presence. I asked you to stay because it was true, not because you saved my life, not because the council required it, not because it was strategically, a brief, almost wry quality to his voice, sensible. Because when you pulled me across your threshold in the middle of a blizzard, something in the way you looked at me, the way you looked at the problem of my being alive as though it was simply a problem to be solved, without calculation, without performance. He stopped. I haven't been looked at that way in a very long time. She thought about that. About a king who was surrounded by people all day and probably rarely encountered anyone who looked at him without the layer of what he was between them and who he was. You looked at me like I was a person, he said. Not plaintively. He was not a man who did plaintive, but simply, stating a fact. You were a person dying on my floor, she said. That was the relevant category. Yes, he said. And you've been, everything since has been. He stopped again, and she realized she was seeing something she had only glimpsed before in him, in the small moments when the professional surface thinned, the actual internal life of him, the part that wasn't managed or presented. You've been someone I didn't know I was missing until you were there. The spring air moved between them, faint and cold, and carrying the first molecule-level warmth that meant the season was actually changing. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Simply. Something in his face, all of it, not just the eyes, changed, opened, in the way that faces open when they stop holding a thing they've been holding. Good, he said, just that word. The one word he kept returning to she had noticed, good, the word that meant this is enough, this is what I wanted, I will hold this and not waste it. She had come to understand that for a man who commanded rooms and nations and moved through the world with the full weight of institutional authority behind every word, good was the thing he said when something was personal, when it wasn't for the record. She turned back to the river. He stood beside her. They watched the snowmelt city together in the early morning, and it was the same quality of silence that had developed between them naturally over the weeks. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but the specific rich silence of two people who have run out of the need to fill space with sound because the space between them is already full. The formal ceremony happened in June. This was not her idea. She would have been content with the private truth of it. The daily reality that had been building itself quietly and without announcement since a night in February, when a man with a royal seal on his arm had opened his eyes in her cabin and found her looking back at him. She was not, she had discovered about herself in the process of the past months, a person who needed the public version of things to make the private version real. But she had also come to understand through the work of the commission and the hours spent in the lower districts and the conversations with Lena and Bryn and Marsh and the 230 and all the others whose stories she was holding, she had come to understand that the public version was not only for her. Vera had said it to her directly, one afternoon in early spring, in the no-nonsense way that Vera said most important things. You understand what it will mean, Vera said, if you become queen. I understand some of it, Mara said, not just for you. For every Omega who wakes up tomorrow in a place like the one you came from. Vera looked at her steadily. They will look at you the way you looked at Alaric across that cabin and understood, from the seal on his arm, that he was something that could change the shape of your life if he chose to. You will be that. Every day, just by being what you are, you will be that for them. Mara held this thought for several days, turned it over, looked at it from the angles she habitually looked at difficult things. The cost, the responsibility, the ways she could fail at it, the ways she might succeed. She had not gone looking for this. She had opened a door into a blizzard because something alive was scratching at it, and everything since had followed from that. She had not planned it. She had not been strategic. She had simply done the thing that was true at each moment, and the truth had accumulated into a path. She was, she decided, at peace with that. The ceremony was held in the great courtyard of the royal fortress, open to the city, a deliberate choice, Alaric's and hers together, made at the same time from slightly different angles. He had said, "I want the whole kingdom to see it." She had said, "I want Lena and Bryn and Marsh in the front row." Both of these things were true, and both of them were honored. Ironwood Territory sent a delegation. She had not expected that. She had known the formal invitation went to all territories, protocol required it, but she had not spent time imagining whether the Ironwood Wolves would actually come, had not prepared herself for the specific complexity of seeing them. They arrived 2 days before the ceremony, 12 wolves, led by the interim administrator the council had appointed, a steady, careful woman named Halsey, who had been doing the work of rebuilding pack culture with the methodical commitment of someone who understood that broken things required sustained attention. Among the 12 was Senna Cole. They met in the eastern courtyard the afternoon before the ceremony, by an arrangement that was not exactly arranged. Senna was there when Mara came through on her way from a meeting, and both of them stopped, and neither of them pretended the meeting was accidental. Senna looked at her. At the clothes, simple, quality, nothing ostentatious. Mara had very firm opinions about ostentatious, and at the way she held herself and at her face, which had changed in 6 months in ways that Senna was clearly cataloging with the quiet attention of a healer noting a patient's recovery. "You look different," Senna said. "I look the same," Mara said. "I'm standing differently." Senna was quiet for a moment. Then, with a small, complicated smile, "Yes, that's exactly it." They walked together for a while. Through the courtyard, around the lower gardens, in the specific companionship of two people navigating the uncertain territory between their history and the present moment. It was not easy. Mara did not make it easy by pretending it was simple, and Senna did not make it worse by performing a warmth she hadn't fully earned back yet. "Lena is well," Senna said. "She's on the pack council now. Halsey pushed for it. She says she's terrified every meeting, but she hasn't missed one." "Good," Mara said. Marsh got the formal apology from the territory. In writing, with the administrator's seal. A pause. He cried, which none of us had ever seen before, and most of us pretended not to notice, which he appreciated. Mara felt something warm move through her at that. She had written the formal apology provision into the charter herself, knowing that some of what had been done couldn't be fixed by policy alone, that there were things that required acknowledgement in the specific personal language of one entity saying to another, "We did wrong. This is known. This is named." "And Bryn?" she asked. "Bryn is—" Senna stopped. "Bryn is becoming something. I don't have the right word for it yet. She came to Territory Council last month and she made an argument about the water distribution system that was so precise and so unanswerable that the discussion was over in 10 minutes. Halsa said it was the best technical presentation she'd heard from anyone in years." Mara stopped walking. She stood in the spring garden of the royal fortress and felt the particular specific joy of a thing she had planted in dark soil with uncertain hope, now growing toward light in its own direction, in its own form, in ways she hadn't predicted and couldn't have planned for. "Good," she said. And it was the same word with the same weight that she had learned from Alaric. The word that meant, this is enough, this is what mattered, this is what the hard things were for. Senna was watching her face. "You're happy," she said, with a kind of wondering quality, as if happiness in Mara was something she had not expected to encounter and was now trying to orient toward. "Yes," Mara said, simply, without qualification. "I am." The morning of the ceremony arrived cold and clear, the specific clean clarity of a northern June day that had burned off the overnight chill and arrived at something bright and exact, the sky a hard, deep blue above the fortress walls. Mara dressed with Vera's help, not because she couldn't manage herself, but because Vera had, over the months, shifted from professional attendant to something that didn't have a clean category, something that sat between colleague and older sister and the specific kind of friend formed in the particular crucible of having almost died together and come through to the other side. Vera fastened the clasp at the back of her collar and stood back and looked at her with the expression she used when she had finished something and was assessing the result. "Well," Vera said. "Well," Mara agreed. "You're going to be a very good queen," Vera said. "Not because of the ceremony. You've been one in practice for 6 months." Mara looked at herself in the glass. She had thought, when she first arrived in the capital, that the person she saw in this mirror was a stranger, someone inhabiting borrowed clothes and borrowed space, and a borrowed version of herself that would eventually be returned. She did not feel that now. What she saw was herself, the same person who had counted 47 pieces of firewood by lamplight and waited for a storm, who had opened a door into a blizzard because something alive was on the other side of it, who had sat in cold rooms and listened to stories that mattered and written them down with her grandmother's precision. The same person, just standing differently. "Thank you," she said to Vera. "For all of it. Not the clasp. Everything." Vera looked away for a moment, and Mara was almost certain she saw the flicker of something in her face, something that Vera's professional composure covered very quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "Don't thank me," Vera said. "I was following orders from my own judgment. You'd have gotten here without me." "Slower," Mara said. "Maybe," Vera said, and allowed herself a very small, precise smile. The courtyard was full. She had understood intellectually that the ceremony would be large, that being in the royal capital, announced formally, open to the city, meant hundreds of people, perhaps thousands. She had not entirely prepared for the reality of it, the solid mass of people filling the space, the sound of them, not loud, a kind of sustained, expectant attention that was its own form of silence, the way the June sunlight hit the fortress stone and threw gold across everything. She came through the inner door at the arranged moment, and the sound that moved through the crowd, not a cheer, not applause, something quieter and more sustained, a low collective exhale that meant there she is, reached her in the chest in a way she had not expected. Not as pressure, as something else, as the specific feeling of being looked at by a gathering of people whose looking contained something other than assessment or judgment or the calculation of what she was worth to them. Lena was in the front row, in a formal territory coat with her back straight and her chin up, and when she caught Mara's eye across the distance, she gave a single, fierce, minimal nod that contained everything the moment required. Bryn was beside her. Looking younger than Mara had expected, seeing her in person for the first time, 17 had seemed abstract in a letter. But standing here it was very real, very young, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone watching proof that a thing they had been told was impossible is possible, who is still in the first moments of that discovery, who has not yet decided what to do with it except hold it carefully and not look away. Marsh was at the end of the row, between Lena and the Ironwood delegation, looking exactly like himself, composed, understated, the magnificent invisibility he had spent decades perfecting, softened today by something that sat on his face and wouldn't quite be made to disappear, something that might, in any other context, be called pride. She walked to where Alaric was standing. He watched her come with the same quality he had brought to everything where she was concerned, the full, unhurried, completely present attention of a man who had decided that this person was worth seeing clearly and had not once, in 6 months, looked away. She stopped in front of him. In his hands was a circlet, simple, dark metal, elegant in the way that only simple things managed, without ornamentation. She had been consulted on it, had specified plain, had said, when shown elaborate options with inset stones and worked gold, "That is not what I am," and he had heard it immediately, and the elaborate options had been set aside without discussion. He looked at her. Just for a moment, just the two of them, in the middle of the courtyard, and the crowd and the sunlight and the formal language of what was about to happen. He looked at her with the thing that was not managed or presented, the private face, the actual person. "Ready?" he said. Quietly, barely above the level of being spoken, the word just for her. She thought about all the times she had been asked if she was ready and had said yes when the true answer was, "I have no choice," or "I don't know," or "I'm afraid, but I'm going anyway." She thought about the door into the blizzard, about the slope and the snow and the rope, about the anteroom before the council and the city walk, and Bryn's cold room and the notebook and the 60-page report, and every morning for 6 months of getting up and doing the work that needed doing, even when the work was slow and uncertain and the outcome was not guaranteed. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent 40 years building something she would not see finished and had built it with precision and care anyway, because the building mattered regardless of whether you were there for the completion. She thought about 47 pieces of birch stacked against an east wall, about a fire that had been kept burning through the longest night of her life. "Yes," she said. He placed the circlet on her head with both hands carefully, and she felt the weight of it settle, real, present, specific, not heavy, just real. The weight of a thing that was actually there. The courtyard erupted. Not the controlled applause of formal ceremony, something more uncontrolled than that, something that came from the crowd the way weather comes, building from somewhere in the back and moving forward until the sound of it was everywhere at once, filling the fortress walls and rising into the June sky with an energy that had nothing performed in it, that was simply the sound of people who had been waiting for something they hadn't known they were waiting for and had now, at this particular moment, received it. Mara stood in the middle of it. She had spent 5 years learning to be invisible, learning to move through rooms without disturbing them, to reduce herself to the minimum possible surface area, to make herself so small and so quiet that the decision to overlook her became easy for the people who wanted to make it. She had been good at it. She had survived on it. She was standing in the center of a courtyard full of hundreds of people, and all of them were looking at her, and the looking contained recognition. And recognition contained the particular kind of power that had nothing to do with dominance or authority or the old hierarchies that had sorted her to the bottom of every list. It was simpler than all of that, more fundamental, the power of being seen. Just that, being seen. She looked at Lena, and Lena looked back. She looked at Bryn, who was crying now, very quietly, in the way of someone who has arrived somewhere they had not permitted themselves to imagine they could arrive. She looked at Marsh, who was not crying, and whose expression was entirely composed, and who was giving her a very small, very precise nod that communicated, in the economy of language she had developed in his 40 years of necessary invisibility, something like, "I knew. I always knew." She looked at Vera, standing to the side with the controlled expression of a woman whose composure was absolute and whose eyes were very bright. She looked at Alaric, who was looking at her with the private face, the person face, the face that had nothing in it except the truth of a man who had spent a night in a broken cabin being kept alive by a woman who did not know him and had chosen him anyway, and had understood something in that choosing that had not, in 6 months, diminished. She let herself be looked at. All of it. The sound and the light and the weight of the circlet and the eyes of 230 and the crowd and the blue June sky and the river she could not see from here but knew was running fast with the last of the season's melt, going somewhere. She let it be real. Let it have the full weight of real things rather than the careful, reduced version she had given to everything for 5 years. Her grandmother had told her, "Put the important things on paper, and the paper in a place the fire can't reach." She had done that. She had put herself on record, in the council chamber, in the 60 pages, in the city walk and the notebook and the small cold rooms where she had sat and listened. She had put herself where the fire couldn't reach her, not by hiding, but by being undeniable. By being so precisely, completely, exactly what she was that the choice to overlook her became impossible. She had done that. And here was the result, not what she had worked toward. She had not been working toward this, had not been strategic, had simply been true. But what had grown from the work, the way things grew in northern soil when you gave them what they actually needed instead of what was easiest to provide. She straightened her shoulders. She was small. She was always going to be small. Her frame, her omega status, The physical facts of her that she had spent years being told were deficiencies. They were not deficiencies. They were the conditions she had learned to work within, and the learning had made her something that was not despite those conditions, but precisely because of them. Someone who understood what was needed, not from a position of comfortable surplus, but from the inside of scarcity, from the knowledge of what it took to survive a winter on 47 pieces of birch, and a grandmother's recipes, and the refusal to accept that survival was the most you were allowed. It wasn't. Survival was the beginning. What came after was the life. She was standing in her life. Outside the fortress walls, below the granite plateau, the city of Vile went on being the city it was, with its 230, and its heating repair, and its complaint routing, and its 17-year-old girls in cold rooms with no formal protections, and all the incremental, sustained, mostly invisible work of changing the shape of a system that had been built facing the wrong direction. She would go back to that work tomorrow. She would go back to it every day after tomorrow for as long as it needed her. It was the work she was built for. It was what she did with what she had. But today she was here. Today the snowmelt river was running fast below the city, and the June sky was enormous above it, and the sound of the courtyard was still moving through her chest, and Alaric was beside her, and Lena and Bryn and Marsh were in the front row. And her grandmother's 40 years of careful building had arrived at last, at the day it had been building toward. She stood in it without flinching. She was the Omega who had been left in the snow to die. She was the wolf who had saved the king. She was the woman who had opened a door into a blizzard because something alive was on the other side of it, and had found, waiting in the dark and the cold and the howling wind, everything that followed. She stood in the sun. She held her ground.